In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy widow's will vanishes, threatening to unravel a fortune and ignite hidden desires. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle smile, steps into a web of secrets. Lionel Brent's crippling debts, Clara Tuttle's haunted past, a loyal housekeeper's watchful gaze, and a scheming clerk's dangerous ambition. As whispers of blackmail and betrayal swirl, Marple unravels a cunning plot where motive and opportunity collide. Will she restore justice before greed tears the village apart? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie mystery. Chapter 1. The Missing Wilther. Late September's sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's thatched cottages and the ancient stone wall of the churchyard. Miss Jane Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room, her delicate hands folded neatly over a worn copy of the parish newsletter. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, bustled about with a teapot, her cheeks flushed from the exertion of hosting the Ladies' Guild meeting. The air was thick with the scent of scones and the low hum of gossip, which, to Miss Marple's keen ears, was as revealing as any sermon. Such a to-do at Hargreaves Manor, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was saying, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she leaned toward Miss Marple. Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves, God rest her soul, passed last week, and now they say her will's gone missing. Vanished like smoke. Her eyes widened, relishing the drama. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind her spectacles, flickered with interest. She adjusted the lace shawl draped over her shoulders and murmured, "A will missing. How very curious." Her tone was gentle, almost absent, but her mind was already turning, sifting through the implications like a gardener inspecting soil. Was it mislaid, perhaps? She asked, knowing full well that Mrs. Price would seize the bait. "Oh no, Miss Marple, not mislaid." Mrs. Price's voice rose, drawing glances from the other ladies. "Mr. Finch, the solicitor from Much Benham, came to read it yesterday, and when he opened his case, not a scrap of paper. They say it's caused a dreadful row-up at the manor. Lionel Brent, her nephew, was there, and Miss Tuttle, that companion of hers, both expecting a fortune, no doubt." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite concern, though her thoughts were far from idle. She had known Eleanor Hargreaves, a formidable widow of 70, whose sharp tongue and sharper mind had ruled Hargreaves Manor with quiet authority. The manor, a sprawling Georgian pile surrounded by manicured gardens, was the envy of the county, and its mistress's wealth was the subject of much village speculation. That her will, presumably detailing the fate of that wealth, should disappear was no small matter. "Do they know when it was last seen?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as she reached for her teacup. She had a way of asking questions that seemed incidental, yet they cut straight to the heart of things. Mrs. Price leaned closer, her hat's feather bobbing. "Mr. Finch swears it was in his office safe, locked tight, only a fortnight ago. His clerk, that Wheeler boy, saw it too. But now, gone. And with no will, who's to say what happens to the estate? There's talk it might go to the Crown, or some such nonsense." Miss Marple's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "The Crown, indeed," she said, her tone faintly amused, "though I imagine those closest to Mrs. Hargreaves might have other ideas." She sipped her tea, her mind conjuring images of Lionel Brent, a handsome, idle young man she'd seen lounging at the village fete, and Clara Tuttle, the mousy companion who had trailed Eleanor like a shadow. Both, she suspected, had pinned their hopes on the widow's generosity. A missing will would unsettle them both, perhaps dangerously so. Mrs. Clement, catching the tail end of the conversation, joined them, her apron dusted with flour. "It's dreadful, isn't it, Jane? Poor Mrs. Hargreaves, not cold in her grave, and already such trouble. I do hope it's found soon. The manor's been so quiet since she passed. No visitors, no parties. Just Lionel and Miss Tuttle rattling about in that big house. And the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, I presume," Miss Marple added, her tone casual. She had met Mrs. Gibbs once, a woman with the sharp eyes of a hawk and the loyalty of a guard dog. Servants, Miss Marple knew, often saw more than their employers realized. "Oh yes, Mrs. Gibbs is still there," Mrs. Price said. "She's been with the family 30 years, you know. If anyone knows what's what, it's her. But she's tight-lipped, that one. Won't say a word against the family." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Servants, in her experience, were like the stitches in her knitting, noticed until a single dropped thread unraveled the whole pattern. "A will is such a personal thing," she mused aloud, almost like a voice from beyond. "Its absence must be disconcerting." Mrs. Price shivered, delighted by the intrigue. "Disconcerting, that's the word, Miss Marple. And you know what they say, where there's money, there's mischief. I wouldn't be surprised if someone's got their sticky fingers on it, hoping to twist things their way." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her face remained serene. "People do the most curious things for money," she said softly, almost to herself. She thought of a case years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a farmer's ledger vanished, only to reappear with altered figures. The culprit had been a trusted friend, driven by greed masked as loyalty. Human nature, she reflected, was as predictable as it was perplexing. As the meeting broke up and the ladies dispersed, Miss Marple stepped into the crisp evening air, her mind alive with possibilities. The missing will was no accident, she felt certain. Someone had taken it, and that someone had a reason, motive, opportunity, or both. She paused by the church gate, her frail figure silhouetted against the fading light, and decided she would pay a visit to Hargreaves Manor. A church newsletter, perhaps, would serve as her excuse. But her true purpose was clearer: to observe, to listen, and to uncover the truth hidden beneath the village's placid surface. Chapter 2. The household at Hargreaves Manor the following morning. A fine mist hung over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a silvery veil that softened the outlines of its cottages and lent an air of mystery to the winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, set out for Hargreaves Manor, her sturdy shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones. In her basket she carried a stack of parish newsletters, a plausible pretext for her visit, though her true purpose was far less ecclesiastical. The news of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had stirred her curiosity, and she felt an irresistible urge to observe the players in this peculiar drama firsthand. A will, she knew, was more than a legal document. It was a map of human desires, and its disappearance suggested a cartographer with something to hide. Hargreaves Manor stood at the edge of the village, its Georgian facade imposing yet elegant, with ivy climbing its weathered stone walls and tall windows reflecting the muted sky. The Rotterin gates were ajar, and as Miss Marple approached, she noted the neglected rose beds, their blooms wilting under the weight of recent neglect. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and decaying petals, a reminder that the manor, like its late mistress, was no longer at its prime. She rang the bell, and after a moment, The heavy oak door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, her angular face set in a mask of professional courtesy. "Good morning, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice bright but tinged with the deference of an elderly spinster. "I've brought the parish newsletters. Thought you might like one for the household." She held up her basket, her eyes meeting the housekeeper's with a disarming smile. Mrs. Gibbs's lips twitched, as if weighing the sincerity of the gesture. "Very kind, Miss Marple," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "Come in, won't you? I'll fetch Mr. Brent. He's in the drawing-room." She stepped aside, her black dress rustling as she led the way through the entrance hall, its marble floor gleaming under a chandelier that, Miss Marple noted, was in need of dusting. The hall was grand but sombre, its walls lined with portraits of Hargreaves' ancestors, their stern gazes following Miss Marple as she passed. A mahogany table held a vase of wilting lilies, their scent cloying in the still air. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint outline of a dust-free rectangle on the table, as if an object, perhaps a box or a book, had recently been removed. She filed the observation away, her mind already weaving possibilities. Small things, she had learned, often betrayed larger truths. Mrs. Gibbs ushered her into the drawing-room, a spacious chamber furnished with faded elegance. Heavy brocade curtains framed the windows, admitting slivers of grey light that danced. On the polished parquet floor, a fire crackled in the grate, casting shadows on the walls, which were adorned with landscapes in gilt frames. Lionel Brent stood by the mantel, a tall, handsome man in his mid-30s, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, and his tie askew. He was dressed in a tweed jacket that, while well cut, bore the faint creases of careless storage. His smile, when he turned to greet Miss Marple, was charming but strained, like an actor unsure of his lines. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. His voice was warm, but his eyes darted briefly to the door, as if expecting an interruption. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Oh, nothing grand," Miss Marple replied, her tone light as she offered him a newsletter. "Just distributing these for the church. I thought I'd stop by, seeing as I was passing. Such a sad time for the manor, with Mrs. Hargreaves gone." She settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her basket resting on her lap, and fixed Lionel with a look of gentle sympathy. Lionel's smile faltered, and he ran a hand through his hair. "Yes, a rotten business," he said, his tone striving for nonchalance. "Aunt Eleanor was, well, a force, you know. The place feels empty without her." He gestured vaguely at the room, then sank onto a sofa, his long legs sprawling as if to fill the silence. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and Miss Clara Tuttle entered, her small, bird-like figure almost lost in the vastness of the room. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, with mousy hair pinned tightly at the nape of her neck and a grey dress that seemed chosen for its ability to fade into the background. Her hands clutched a handkerchief, which she twisted nervously as she approached. Her pale eyes flickered from Lionel to Miss Marple, and she managed a thin smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, her voice soft but edged with anxiety. "I'm afraid we're rather at 6s and 7s just now." She hesitated, then perched on the edge of a chair, her posture rigid. "Not at all, Miss Tuttle," Miss Marple said warmly. "I only wished to offer my condolences. Mrs. Hargreaves was so admired in the village." She paused, her gaze lingering on Clara's trembling hands. "It must be difficult, managing the household in such circumstances." Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a tight line. "It is," she murmured, "but we manage. Mrs. Gibbs is a great help, and Lionel." She glanced at him, then away, as if unsure how to finish the thought. Lionel laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Oh, I'm no use at managing anything, am I, Clara? I leave that to you and Gibbs." He leaned back, his fingers drumming on the arm of the sofa, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. Despite the coolness of the room, Mrs. Gibbs reappeared, carrying a silver tea tray with a precision that suggested long practice. She set it on a low table, her movements economical, her eyes scanning the room as if cataloguing every detail. "Will you take tea, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone neutral but her gaze sharp. "Thank you, I'd love some," Miss Marple replied, her smile unwavering. As Mrs. Gibbs poured, Miss Marple observed the dynamics of the room. Lionel's forced cheer, Clara's nervous deference, and Mrs. Gibbs's watchful silence formed a tableau of unease, as if each were playing a part in a play they hadn't rehearsed. The missing will, she suspected, was the absent script, and its loss had thrown them all off balance. The tea was strong and fragrant, served in delicate porcelain cups that bore the Hargreaves crest. Miss Marple sipped hers slowly, her eyes drifting to a sideboard where a photograph of Mrs. Hargreaves stood, her stern face softened by a rare smile. "Such a lovely portrait," she remarked. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "Oh, she was," Clara said quickly, her voice gaining a touch of warmth. "So kind, so generous. She took me in when I had nowhere else to go. I owe her everything." Her eyes glistened, and she dabbed at them with her handkerchief. Lionel snorted softly, then caught himself. "Aunt Eleanor had her ways," he said, his tone ambiguous. "She liked things done properly, didn't she, Clara? Kept us all on our toes." He reached for a biscuit, his movements restless. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of benign interest. "A strong character leaves a strong legacy," she said. "I understand there's been some difficulty with her will. How distressing that must be." She let the words hang, her tone sympathetic but her eyes alert for their reactions. Clara's cup rattled against its saucer, and she set it down hastily. "It's most unfortunate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Finch is doing all he can, but it's such a shock." Lionel's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "It's a damned nuisance, that's what it is," he said, his attempt at levity failing to mask his frustration. "Finch swears it was in his safe, but now it's gone, and we're all left twiddling our thumbs. Not that I'm worried," he added quickly, his smile returning like a curtain drawn across a window. "It'll turn up." Mrs. Gibbs, who had been hovering near the door, spoke for the first time. "It's not right, a lady's wishes going astray like that," she said, her voice low but firm. Mrs. Hargreaves was particular about her affairs. She'd not have stood for this. Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and there was a glint of something anger, perhaps, or suspicion, before she looked away. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Gibbs's loyalty to her late mistress was evident, but her words carried a weight that suggested more than mere indignation. Clara's distress seemed genuine, yet her nervous demeanour hinted at a fear beyond the loss of the will, and Lionel, his careless bravado, was a thin veneer, stretched taut over something less certain: greed, fear, or guilt. Miss Marple couldn't yet say, but she felt the threads of the mystery beginning to form a pattern. She turned the conversation to village matters. the upcoming harvest festival, the new curate's sermons, watching as the trio relaxed, or pretended to. Lionel recounted a humorous anecdote about a runaway pig at last year's fete, his laughter a touch too loud. Clara offered a timid opinion on the church choir, her hands still twisting her handkerchief. Mrs. Gibbs, silent now, cleared the tea, things with a precision that bordered on mechanical. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused by the sideboard, her fingers brushing the edge of the photograph. "Such a fine likeness," she said, her tone wistful. "It's a comfort too. Have reminders of those we've lost." She glanced at Clara, who nodded, her eyes welling again, and at Lionel, whose smile had faded, leaving his face oddly blank. Mrs. Gibbs escorted her to the door, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for the newsletter, Miss Marple," she said, her voice flat. "We'll see it's read." "Oh, I'm sure you will," Miss Marple replied, her smile as bright as ever. "And do let me know if there's anything I can do. These are trying times." She stepped into the mist, her basket swinging lightly, and felt the housekeeper's eyes on her back until the door closed as she walked back to the village. The manor receding into the fog, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. The household at Hargreaves Manor was a microcosm of tension, each member bound by their own hopes and fears. Lionel's charm masked a restlessness that spoke of debts or desperation. Clara's devotion to her late employer was touching, but her anxiety suggested secrets she dared not voice. And Mrs. Gibbs, with her fierce loyalty and sharp eyes, was a sentinel who saw more than she said. The missing will, Miss Marple felt certain, was not lost but taken, and the thief was likely someone within that very house. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a farmer's deed had vanished, only to be found in the possession of a trusted cousin with gambling debts. Motive and opportunity, she mused, were the twin pillars of such crimes. Someone at Hargreaves Manor had both, and she intended to find out who. Her steps quickened, and by the time she reached her cottage, her mind was alight with plans. A word with the village tailor, perhaps, or a chat with the postman who delivered to the manor. Small threads, but in her hands they could unravel the tightest knot. Chapter 3. The Solicitor's Clerk. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning of brittle sunshine. The mist of the previous day burned away to reveal a sky of unyielding blue. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out her cottage window at the chrysanthemums nodding in the breeze. Her mind, however, was not on the garden but on the peculiar affair at Hargreaves Manor. The missing will, she felt certain, was no mere misadventure but a deliberate act, and her visit to the manor had only sharpened her curiosity. Lionel Brent's strained charm, Clara Tuttle's nervous deference, and Mrs. Gibbs's watchful silence had painted a picture of a household on edge, each member tethered to the absent document by their own private hopes or fears. Today, she resolved, she would turn her attention to the solicitor's office in Much Benham, where the will had last been seen. Miss Marple donned her best tweed coat and a hat adorned with a single velvet rose, her appearance as unassuming as ever, but her purpose resolute. She caught the mid-morning bus to Much Benham, a market town some 5 miles from St. Mary Mead, and alighted in the High Street, where the offices of Finch & Sons, solicitors, occupied a narrow Georgian building with a polished brass plaque. The town was bustling with farmers' wives haggling over cabbages and shopkeepers sweeping their stoops. But Miss Marple's focus was singular. She climbed the steps to the solicitor's office, her basket swinging lightly, and pushed open the door to a small oak-panelled waiting room that smelled of wax polish and old paper. A young woman at a typewriter looked up, her fingers pausing. Mid-clatter, "Good morning, ma'am," she said, her voice brisk. "Do you have an appointment?" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "I'm Miss Marple, from St. Mary Mead. I was hoping to have a word with Mr. Finch about a small matter concerning Mrs. Hargreaves's estate. I shan't take much of his time." She adjusted her shawl, her eyes taking in the room's details. A filing cabinet with a slightly ajar drawer, a coat rack bearing a man's trilby, and a door marked P. Finch-esque that stood slightly open, revealing a murmur of voices. Within, the receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see if he's free. Please wait here." She disappeared through the door, and Miss Marple settled onto a hard-backed chair, her basket on her lap. Her ears, sharp despite her age, caught snatches of conversation from the inner office. Mr. Finch's measured tones and a younger, more agitated voice. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence suggested a discussion of some urgency. Her lips twitched. Urgency, in her experience, often accompanied guilt. The receptionist returned, her expression apologetic. "Mr. Finch can see you now, Miss Marple. This way, please." She led her into a spacious office where Mr. Percival Finch, a portly man with a florid complexion and wire-rimmed spectacles, rose from behind a cluttered desk. His suit was impeccable, but his tie was slightly askew, a detail Miss Marple noted as a sign of distraction. "Miss Marple, a pleasure," he said, extending a hand. His voice was hearty, but his eyes were wary, as if sizing her up. "Do sit down. I understand you're here about Mrs. Hargreaves's estate." Beside him stood a young man, lean and sallow, with dark hair slicked back and eyes that darted like a cornered animal's. He wore a neatly pressed suit, but his cuffs were frayed and his fingers fidgeted with a pencil. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Ernest Wheeler, the clerk Mrs. Price had mentioned. His presence was fortuitous. She had hoped to observe him, and here he was, delivered as neatly as a parcel. "Yes, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair and smoothing her skirt. "I'm a neighbour of sorts, from St. Mary Mead, and I was so sorry to hear of the trouble with Mrs. Hargreaves's will. Such a distressing thing for all concerned. I thought perhaps I might offer my sympathies and, if I may be so bold, inquire how the matter stands." Her tone was gentle, almost apologetic, but her eyes were keen, watching both men for their reactions. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, his fingers adjusting his spectacles. "Most unfortunate, Miss Marple, most unfortunate. The will was in my safe, secure as you please, until I went to retrieve it for the reading. I can't think how it's gone missing. Ernest here," he gestured to the clerk, who stiffened, "saw it last, didn't you, lad?" Ernest nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice thin but controlled. "I locked it in the safe myself 2 weeks ago, after Mrs. Hargreaves reviewed it. The key was in its usual place, in the desk drawer." He met Miss Marple's gaze briefly, then looked away, his fingers tightening on the pencil. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "How extraordinary," she said. "A safe is such a secure place, isn't it? And yet keys can be so easily misplaced. Or borrowed, perhaps." She let the words linger, her tone as innocent as a vicar's sermon. Ernest's cheeks flushed, and he shifted his weight. "The key's gone, ma'am," he said quickly. "I looked everywhere. It must have been mislaid." His eyes flicked to Mr. Finch, who frowned but said nothing. Mr. Finch leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped over his waistcoat. "We're doing all we can, Miss Marple. I've notified the authorities, though they're as baffled as I. The will named Mr. Brent and Miss Tuttle as equal beneficiaries a substantial estate. You understand, its absence creates complications," he sighed, his jowls quivering. "I assure you, we're turning the office upside down." Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of sympathy. "Of course, Mr. Finch, it must be a great strain. And for you, Mr. Wheeler," she added, turning to Ernest with a kindly smile, "it must be dreadfully dull, all this paperwork and safekeeping. A young man like you, with ambitions, I dare say." Her voice was warm, but her eyes missed nothing. Ernest's shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in his hand as he set the pencil down. "Dull enough, ma'am," Ernest said, forcing a smile. "But I'm loyal to Mr. Finch. It's good work, steady." His words were rehearsed, almost mechanical, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the coolness of the room. "Loyalty is a fine thing," she said softly, her mind recalling a village shop assistant who had pilfered from the till, swearing allegiance to his employer all the while. "But ambition can be a restless companion, can't it? I knew a young man once in St. Mary Mead who dreamed of opening his own business. He took shortcuts, poor lad." She sighed, her tone wistful, but her gaze was steady. Watching Ernest's reaction, his eyes narrowed just for a moment before he recovered his composure. "I keep my nose clean, ma'am," he said, his voice a touch sharper. "No shortcuts here." He glanced at Mr. Finch, who was riffling through a stack of papers, seemingly oblivious to the exchange. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "I'm sure you do, Mr. Wheeler. It's only that this business with the will is so puzzling. A document doesn't simply walk away, does it?" She paused, her fingers adjusting the handle of her basket. "Unless someone helps it along." Mr. Finch looked up, his brow furrowing. "Now, Miss Marple, I hope you're not suggesting anything untoward. Ernest has been with me 3 years, and I've never had cause to doubt him." His tone was firm, but there was a note of unease, as if the possibility had crossed his mind. "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "I'm only an old woman, prone to idle thoughts. But I do wonder who else had access to the safe. A solicitor's office must be a busy place." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving from Mr. Finch to Ernest, inviting them to fill the silence. Mr. Finch hesitated, then spread his hands. "Only myself and Ernest, really. The receptionist, Miss Carter, doesn't handle such things, and the safe is in my private office, locked at all times. It's quite secure, so I thought." He shook his head, his frustration palpable. Ernest nodded vigorously. "That's right, ma'am, just us two. And I'm careful, always. Mrs. Hargreaves trusted us to manage her affairs properly." His voice was earnest, but his eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and she noted the way his fingers resumed their fidgeting. Now toying with a paperclip, Mrs. Hargreaves was fortunate to have such diligence, Miss Marple said, her tone approving. "I understand you visited the manor often, Mr. Wheeler, delivering papers and such. It must have been a privilege to see her in her element." She watched him closely, her words a gentle probe. Ernest's flush deepened, and he coughed, clearing his throat. "I went when Mr. Finch sent me, ma'am. Routine business, that's all. Mrs. Hargreaves was particular, but kind enough." He glanced at the clock on the wall, as if eager to escape the conversation. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing his unease. Ernest's access to the manor, combined with his proximity to the safe, made him a figure of interest. His nervous demeanor suggested a man with something to hide, perhaps the will itself, or knowledge of its fate. She thought of a young gardener in St. Mary Mead who had stolen a silver cigarette case, his guilt betrayed by the same restless hands and averted eyes. Human nature, she reflected, was a predictable tapestry, woven with threads of greed and fear. Mr. Finch, sensing the conversation had strayed, rose from his chair. "Well, Miss Marple, I appreciate your concern, but I'm afraid I have another appointment. Rest assured, we're doing everything possible to locate the will. If you'll excuse us." He gestured toward the door, his politeness firm. "Of course, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, rising with a grace that belied her age. "I've taken enough of your time. Thank you for indulging an old woman's curiosity. And you, Mr. Wheeler," she added, turning to Ernest with a smile, "do take care. A clerk's life is so full of responsibility." Her words were kind, but her eyes held a glint of steel, and Ernest's answering nod was stiff as she stepped back into the waiting room. Miss Marple paused by the filing cabinet, her fingers brushing the open drawer. Inside, she glimpsed a folder labeled Hargreaves, its edges worn as if frequently handled. She made a mental note, then thanked the receptionist and left the office, her mind buzzing with impressions. Ernest Wheeler was no mere bystander, she felt certain. His ambition, his access, and his unease marked him as a thread in the pattern, one she would need to follow. The high street was quieter now, the market stalls packing up for the day. Miss Marple decided to linger in Much Benham, her instincts telling her that Ernest might reveal more outside the confines of the office. She found a tea room across the street, its windows offering a clear view of Finch and Sons, and ordered a pot of Darjeeling. As she sipped, she watched the office door, her thoughts turning over the morning's encounter. Ernest's defensiveness, his quick denials, and his physical discomfort all pointed to a man under pressure. But was he the thief, or merely a witness to another's crime? She recalled a village postman who had covered for a friend's theft, his guilt manifesting in the same nervous tics. The truth, she knew, lay in the details. Half an hour later, her patience was rewarded. Ernest emerged from the office, his trilby pulled low and his shoulders hunched. He glanced up and down the street, then set off at a brisk pace toward the station. Miss Marple, with the agility of a woman half her age, paid her bill and followed. At a discreet distance, her basket swinging as she navigated the cobblestones. Ernest's haste suggested a purpose, perhaps a meeting or an errand related to the will. She kept him in sight, her mind alert for any clue or dropped paper, a furtive glance that might illuminate his role. At the station, Ernest purchased a ticket and boarded a train to London, his movements hurried but deliberate. Miss Marple, unable to follow without arousing suspicion, noted the destination and returned to the tea room to reflect. London, she mused, was a place of opportunities and temptations. A young man with ambitions might seek allies there, or a means to profit from a stolen document. She thought of Lionel Brent's debts, Clara Tuttle's fears, and Mrs. Gibbs's loyalty, each a piece in the puzzle. But Ernest, with his access to the safe and his visits to the manor, was a link she could not ignore. As she boarded the bus back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. She would need to learn more about Ernest Wheeler, his habits, his associates, his dreams. A word with the Much Benham station master perhaps, or a discreet inquiry at the manor about his visits. The missing will was a knot, and Ernest was a thread she intended to pull. By the time she reached her cottage, her resolve was firm. The solicitor's clerk, with his darting eyes and restless hands, was a man to watch, and Miss Marple was nothing if not watchful. Chapter 4. Village gossip. The late September days in St. Mary Mead carried a crispness that heralded autumn, with leaves turning amber and the air tinged with the scent of wood smoke. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cosy parlour with a skein of pale blue wool and her knitting needles, appeared the picture of serene domesticity. Yet her mind was far from idle, turning over the enigma of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will. Her visits to Hargreaves Manor and the solicitor's office in Much Benham had sharpened her sense of the players in this drama Lionel, Brent's strained nonchalance, Clara Tuttle's anxious deference, Mrs. Gibbs's guarded loyalty, and Ernest Wheeler's nervous ambition. Each, she felt, held a piece of the puzzle, but the village itself, with its ceaseless chatter, might offer the threads to weave them together. Today, she resolved to immerse herself in the lifeblood of St. Mary Mead. Its gossip Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her basket and donned a sensible wool coat, its muted green blending with the hedgerows as she stepped into the village. Her destination was the Blue Boar Tea Room, a modest establishment on the High Street where the women of St. Mary Mead gathered to exchange news over scones and Earl Grey. The tea room's bow window, framed with chintz curtains, offered a view of the bustling street, but its true value lay in the conversations within, where truths were often spoken under the guise of idle talk. Miss Marple pushed open the door, the bell jingling softly, and was greeted by the warm aroma of baking and the murmur of voices. Mrs. Lucy Weatherby, the tea room's proprietress, bustled forward, her round face beaming. "Miss Marple, what a treat. Come, there's a table by the window, just for you." She led her to a spot where sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating a lace tablecloth and a vase of late roses. "Will it be your usual pot of Darjeeling?" "Yes, thank you, Lucy," Miss Marple replied, her smile as gentle as ever. She settled into a cushioned chair, her basket at her feet, and surveyed the room. At one table, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was deep in conversation with Miss Hartnell, a spinster known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. At another, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, held court with two farmers' wives, her gestures animated. The air hummed with the cadence of village life, and Miss Marple's ears, attuned to nuance, were ready to sift the wheat from the chaff. As Mrs. Weatherby poured her tea, Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low. "Such a sad business at Hargreaves Manor, Lucy. I hear the will's gone missing. The village must be full of talk." Her tone was one of mild curiosity, but her eyes gleamed, inviting confidences. Lucy's eyes widened, and she set the teapot down with a clink. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone can talk about. A will vanished like that, well, it's not natural, is it? Folk are saying all sorts. Some reckon Lionel Brent's behind it, wanting the whole estate for himself. Others think Miss Tuttle's got something to do with it, her being so close to Mrs. Hargreaves." She lowered her voice, glancing round. "And then there's talk of that clerk, Wheeler, from Much Benham. Shifty sort, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "People do love a mystery," she said, stirring her tea. "But it's all speculation, isn't it? What do they say about Lionel Brent?" She sipped her tea, her gaze steady, encouraging Lucy to elaborate. Lucy leaned closer, her apron rustling. "Well, Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, swears like in debt up to his ears. Says he overheard him at the Red Lion, talking to some London chap about owing money to a bookmaker. Reckons Lionel might have taken the will to make sure he gets the lot, not just half. Mind you, Tompkins likes a story, but there's no smoke without fire, is there?" She straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "I'll fetch you some scones, Miss Marple. You think on that?" As Lucy bustled away, Miss Marple's mind turned over the butcher's tale. Lionel's debts, if true, provided a motive as old as time-greed, sharpened by desperation. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead who had forged a cheque to cover gambling losses, his charm a mask for panic. Lionel's easy laughter at the manor, she reflected, had carried a similar edge. But gossip was a slippery thing, often distorted by the teller's bias. She would need to verify Mr. Tompkins's story, perhaps with a visit to the Red Lion's landlord. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Clement, who slid into the chair opposite, her face alight with purpose. "Jane, I hoped I'd find you here," she said, her voice warm but tinged with excitement. "This business with the Willets dreadful, isn't it? I've just been talking to Miss Hartnell, and she's got a theory about Clara Tuttle." She leaned forward, her bonnet's ribbons swaying. "She says Clara's not as meek as she seems. Thinks she might have hidden the will, fearing Lionel would squander the estate." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression one of polite surprise. Clara Tuttle. How intriguing. What makes Miss Hartnell think so? She poured a second cup of tea, her movements deliberate, inviting Mrs. Clement to elaborate. Mrs. Clement's eyes sparkled. "Well, Miss Hartnell says Clara was always at Mrs. Hargreaves's side, managing her letters, her appointments, everything. She knew the household inside out. And she's got no family, no prospects. If Lionel got the manor, where would that leave her? Miss Hartnell reckons Clara might have taken the will to protect her share, or even to negotiate with Lionel." She paused, then added, "Mind you, Miss Hartnell's always been suspicious of quiet types." Miss Marple nodded, her lips twitching. Miss Hartnell's penchant for suspicion was well known, but her theory held a kernel of plausibility. Clara's devotion to Mrs. Hargreaves, coupled with her precarious position, could breed fear or cunning. At the manor, Clara's trembling hands and averted eyes had suggested more than grief. Perhaps it was the weight of a secret. Miss Marple thought of a village seamstress who had once hidden a stolen brooch, her meekness a shield for boldness. "Clara does seem devoted," she murmured, "but devotion can be a complex thing, can't it?" Mrs. Clement nodded vigorously. "Exactly, Jane, and there's more. Miss Hartnell heard from Mrs. Gibbs's cousin, who cleans for the vicar, that Clara was seen in Much Benham the day before the will went missing, near the solicitor's office, no less. Now, what was she doing there?" She sat back, satisfied with her revelation. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her teacup. This was new and significant. Clara's presence in Much Benham could be innocent. Shopping trip, a visit to the library, but its timing was suggestive. Had she gone to see Mr. Finch, or perhaps Ernest Wheeler? Or was she, as Miss Hartnell implied, meddling with the will? "How curious," Miss Marple said softly. "Though I suppose Much Benham is a small place. One might be seen anywhere." Her tone was neutral, but her mind was racing, fitting this piece into the pattern. Before Mrs. Clement could respond, Mrs. Price approached, her hat askew and her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Clement, have you heard the latest?" she said, pulling up a chair without invitation. It's about that Wheeler boy, the solicitor's clerk. My nephew, who works at the Much Benham post office, says Ernest was sending parcels to London last week, fancy ones, with wax seals. Now, what's a clerk doing with business like that? I reckon he's up to no good. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her face remained serene. Parcels to London. How interesting, she said, her voice mild. Perhaps they were for Mr. Finch's clients. She tilted her head, inviting Mrs. Price to speculate. Mrs. Price, snorted client, my foot. My nephew says Ernest looked nervous as a cat, checking over his shoulder like he was afraid of being caught. And those parcels too small for legal papers, he said. More like letters, or something valuable. I wouldn't put it past him to have taken the will, Miss Marple. He's got those shifty eyes. She folded her arms, satisfied with her verdict. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over this fresh tidbit. Ernest's parcels, if true, suggested a connection beyond Much Benham perhaps, a scheme to profit from the will, or to conceal it. Her encounter with him at the solicitor's office had revealed a young man with ambition and unease, his fidgeting hands betraying a restless spirit. The parcels could be a clue or a distraction, but they warranted investigation, she thought. Of a village boy who had sent stolen coins to a pawnbroker, his furtive trips to the post office, his undoing. Young men can be so enterprising, she murmured, but enterprise can lead one astray, can't it? Mrs. Price nodded, oblivious. To the depth of Miss Marple's musing. That's what I say. And there's more. Mrs. Gibbs told my sister-in-law that Ernest was at the manor the day before Mrs. Hargreaves died, delivering papers. Stayed longer than usual, too. Now, what was he doing, poking about like that? She leaned forward, her voice dropping. I reckon he saw his chance and took it. Miss Marple's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Mrs. Gibbs's gossip, filtered through multiple mouths, was likely embellished, but the detail of Ernest's visit was worth pursuing. His access to the manor, combined with his role at the solicitor's office, placed him at the heart of the mystery. Had he lingered to snoop, to steal, or to plant a seed of confusion? She made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Gibbs directly. Bypassing the villagers' game of telephone, the tea room grew busier, with new arrivals adding to the hum of conversation. Miss Marple, content to listen, let the gossip swirl around her, each snippet a brushstroke in the portrait of the case. A farmer's wife mentioned Lionel's recent purchase of a new motorcar. Despite his debts, fueling speculation of hidden wealth or reckless borrowing. Another woman whispered that Clara had been seen crying in the churchyard, her distress attributed to fear of poverty rather than grief, and a passing comment about Mrs. Gibbs's fierce loyalty to Mrs. Hargreaves hinted at a woman who might protect her mistress's legacy at any cost. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple rose, thanking Mrs. Weatherby for the tea, and slipping a shilling onto the table. She stepped into the high street, her mind alight with the villagers' theories. Gossip, she knew, was a distorted mirror, reflecting truth through a haze of exaggeration and bias. Yet within it lay kernels of fact. Lionel's debts, Clara's visit to Much Benham, Ernest's parcels, and Mrs. Gibbs's observations, each pointed to a motive: greed, fear, ambition, or loyalty that might explain the will's disappearance. She decided to visit her old friend Dolly Bantry, whose manor house lay just outside the village. Dolly, with her sharp wit and unfiltered opinions, was a sounding board for Miss Marple's thoughts, and her connections to the county's gentry might yield further insights. The walk to Bantry Manor was pleasant, the lanes lined with blackberry, bushes heavy with fruit. Miss Marple plucked a berry, its tartness sharpening her focus, and by the time she reached the manor's gates, her plan was clear. She would sift the gossip, verify its truths, and trace the threads back to the will. Dolly Bantry greeted her with a cry of delight, ushering her into a sunny drawing room where a fire crackled. "Jane, you old sleuth, what brings you here?" she said, pouring sherry from a decanter. "Don't tell me it's that Hargreaves business. The whole county's buzzing about it." Miss Marple smiled, accepting the glass. "I'm afraid it is, Dolly. The village is full of talk, and I thought you might have heard something. People say the most curious things, don't they?" She recounted the tea room's gossip, her tone light but her eyes watchful, gauging Dolly's reactions. Dolly laughed, her eyes twinkling. "Curious? They're positively wild. Lionel Brent, a thief. Clara Tuttle, a schemer. And that clerk Wheeler. Is it? Sounds like a villain from a penny dreadful. But you, Jane, you see through it all, don't you? What's your take?" She leaned forward, eager for Miss Marple's insight. Miss Marple sipped her sherry, her expression thoughtful. "People talk, Dolly, but they rarely see. The truth is in the details. Lionel's debts, Clara's fears, Ernest's ambitions. Someone took that will, and the village knows more than it thinks. I mean to find out what." Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it, the resolve of a woman who had unraveled many a knot. Dolly grinned. "You're a marvel, Jane. If anyone can sort this mess, it's you. But be careful, money makes people dangerous." She raised her glass, a mock toast to Miss Marple's quest. As Miss Marple walked home in the gathering dusk, the village, lights twinkling like stars, her mind was busy. The gossip had given her leads to follow. A visit to the Red Lion to confirm Lionel's debts, a chat with Mrs. Gibbs about Ernest's visit, and an inquiry at the Much Benham post office about those parcels. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a stolen necklace was traced through whispered rumors to a maid's lover. Gossip, she reflected, was the village's pulse, and she would use it to find the heart of the mystery. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work unraveling. The truth was just beginning. Chapter 5. A discovery in the study. The golden light of an autumn afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green and gilding the rooftops with a mellow glow. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting safely tucked into her basket, walked briskly toward Hargreaves Manor, her mind as sharp as the crisp air. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had deepened with each encounter. Lionel Brent's uneasy charm, Clara Tuttle's anxious silences, Mrs. Gibbs's guarded loyalty, Ernest Wheeler's nervous ambition, and the villagers' swirling gossip. Each thread suggested a motive, but none yet formed a clear pattern. Today, a chance remark from Mrs. Gibbs, relayed through the vicar's wife, had prompted this visit. The housekeeper had found something in the manor study, and Miss Marple, under the guise of collecting for the church restoration fund, intended to learn more. Hargreaves Manor loomed at the village's edge, its Georgian elegance softened by ivy and the patina of age. The gravel drive crunched under Miss Marple's sensible shoes as she approached, noting the untended lawns and the faint air of neglect that had settled since Mrs. Hargreaves's death. She rang the bell, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Gibbs, her angular face as unyielding as ever, though her eyes held a flicker of curiosity. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but deferential. "I'm collecting for the church roof, such a worthy cause, don't you think? I hoped I might have a word with Mr. Brent or Miss Tuttle." She held up a small notebook, her smile disarming, though her gaze was alert, scanning the housekeeper's expression. Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then stepped aside. Mr. Brent's out, Miss Marple and Miss Tuttle's resting. But come in, I'll make you a cup of tea. The manner's quiet today. Her tone was neutral, but there was a tightness in her jaw, as if she were weighing her words. She led Miss Marple through the grand entrance hall, where the portraits of Hargreaves' ancestors gazed down with silent judgment, and into the drawing room, its faded elegance unchanged since Miss Marple's last visit, as Mrs. Gibbs disappeared. To fetch the tea, Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her basket on her lap. The room was as she remembered: brocade curtains, gilt-framed landscapes, and the photograph of Mrs. Hargreaves on the sideboard, her stern face softened by a rare smile. But her eyes were drawn to a small table near the window, where a stack of unopened letters lay, their edges curling. One envelope bore the crest of Finch and Sons, the solicitor's firm, and Miss Marple's lips twitched. Correspondence, she knew, could reveal as much as conversation, if one knew where to look. Mrs. Gibbs returned with a tray, her movements precise as she poured tea into porcelain cups. "You're kind to call, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "The manner's not been the same since Mrs. Hargreaves passed. All this fuss about the Willets, not what she'd have wanted." She set the teapot down with a faint clink, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before darting away. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression sympathetic. "It's a dreadful business, Mrs. Gibbs. A will is such a personal thing, like a final word. Its loss must weigh heavily on you, being so loyal to Mrs. Hargreaves." She paused, her tone gentle but probing, inviting the housekeeper to share more. Mrs. Gibbs's lips tightened, and she smoothed her apron. "It does, Miss Marple. She was particular, my lady was, about her affairs. Everything in its place, always. That will was her wish, and now," she trailed off, her hands clenching briefly before relaxing, "I found something yesterday in the study. I didn't know who to tell, but seeing as you're here..." Her voice dropped, and she glanced toward the door, as if fearing interruption. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Something in the study. How intriguing, Mrs. Gibbs. May I ask what it was?" Her voice was soft, almost conspiratorial, and she set her cup down, giving the housekeeper her full attention. Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket and produced a small, torn envelope. It was cream-coloured, its edges frayed, and bore the wax seal of Finch and Sons, broken but unmistakable. "This," she said, handing it to Miss Marple. "It was under the blotter on the study desk. I was dusting, and there it was, hidden, like empty, mind you, but it's from the solicitors, no mistake." Miss Marple took the envelope, her fingers tracing the seal as she examined it. The wax was cracked but intact, suggesting the contents had been removed with care, not haste. The paper was heavy, the kind used for important documents, and the tear at one corner was clean, as if made by a letter opener. "How extraordinary," she murmured, her mind racing. "An envelope from Mr. Finch's office, hidden in the study, and empty, you say?" She looked up, her gaze steady but kind, encouraging Mrs. Gibbs to elaborate. The housekeeper nodded, her face grim. "Empty as a church on Monday. I thought it odd, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves kept her papers tidy, always. Locked in her desk or sent to Mr. Finch. Why hide an empty envelope? Unless..." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Unless someone put it there to make trouble." Miss Marple's lips twitched, not quite a smile, a perceptive thought. Mrs. Gibbs, may I see the study? It might help to understand the context. As it were. Her tone was mild, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The envelope, empty or not, was a clue, a deliberate act, or a careless mistake. And either way, it pointed to someone with access to the manner and knowledge of the will. Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then nodded. No harm in it, I suppose. Follow me. She led Miss Marple through a corridor lined with oak panelling. Its walls hung with faded tapestries, to the study, a smaller room, but no less grand, with tall windows overlooking the gardens and a mahogany desk dominating the space. Bookshelves lined one wall, their leather-bound volumes exuding an air of quiet authority. And a fireplace, cold now, bore the Hargreaves crest above the mantel. The desk was orderly, with an inkstand, a blotter, and a few scattered papers, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the blotter, its green leather slightly askew. As if recently disturbed, Mrs. Gibbs pointed to it. There, under that. I lifted it to dust, and the envelope was tucked beneath, flat as you please. No one's been in here much since she passed, except Mr. Brent and Miss Tuttle, and me, of course. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but there was a note of suspicion, as if she were testing Miss Marple's reaction. Miss Marple approached the desk, her fingers brushing the blotter as she examined the spot. The envelope, now in her hand, seemed out of place in the room's meticulous order, a discordant note in a symphony of precision. She set it down and lifted the blotter herself, peering beneath for any other clues. A scrap of paper, a smudge of ink, but found nothing. Curious, she said softly. Hidden, yet not destroyed, as if someone wanted it found, perhaps. She looked at Mrs. Gibbs, her expression thoughtful. Who uses the study now, Mrs. Gibbs? Mr. Brent, you said, and Miss Tuttle. The housekeeper nodded, her arms crossed. Mr. Brent comes in to read the papers, or so he says. Miss Tuttle sometimes writes letters. Here says, it's quieter than the drawing room, but neither's been in much lately. Too upset, I reckon, with all this will business. Her tone was guarded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, as if she questioned their motives. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. Lionel, with his debts and careless charm, might have hidden the envelope to cast suspicion elsewhere, to retrieve it later. Clara, with her nervous devotion, could have concealed it out of fear, or to protect her inheritance. And Mrs. Gibbs herself, with her fierce loyalty, might have found more than she admitted. Miss Marple thought of a village widow who had hidden a stolen locket, her loyalty to a wayward son her undoing. A study is a private place, she mused, but privacy invites secrets, doesn't it? Mrs. Gibbs's lips twitched, as if suppressing a reply. It does, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves used to say this room held her thoughts. Now it's holding someone else's, I wager. She glanced at the door, her posture stiffening. I'd best get back to my duties. Will you stay for more tea? Miss Marple shook her head, her smile warm. No, thank you, Mrs. Gibbs. You've been most kind. May I keep the envelope? It might be useful to Mr. Finch to trace its origins. She held it up, her tone casual, though her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of reluctance. Mrs. Gibbs shrugged, her face unreadable. Take it, if you like. It's no use to me. She led Miss Marple back to the drawing room, where the tea tray still sat, the cups now cold. As they passed through the entrance hall, Miss Marple's eyes fell again on the mahogany table, where The dust-free rectangle she had noticed before seemed more pronounced, as if an object had been moved recently. She made a mental note, her mind turning over the possibility of another hidden clue. At the door, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the knob. "Mrs. Gibbs, you mentioned visitors to the manor before Mrs. Hargreaves's death. Did anyone from Mr. Finch's office come by? Perhaps Mr. Wheeler, for instance?" Her voice was light, almost incidental, but her gaze was steady, probing for a reaction. Mrs. Gibbs's eyes narrowed, just for a moment. "Ernest Wheeler, you mean? He was here, about a week before she passed. Brought some papers for her to sign. Stayed longer than usual, chatting with Miss Tuttle in the garden. I didn't think much of it at the time." Her tone was flat, but there was a hint of disapproval, as if Ernest's presence had been an intrusion. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "How interesting. Well, thank you again, Mrs. Gibbs. I'll let you know if the envelope proves useful." She stepped into the afternoon light, the envelope tucked safely in her basket, and felt the housekeeper's gaze on her back until the door closed as she walked back to the village. The manor fading into the golden haze, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. The envelope was a tangible link to the missing will. Its presence in the study a deliberate act, whether to conceal, to mislead, or to accuse. Ernest Wheeler's visit, lingering with Clara in the garden, added a new dimension. Had he been scoping the manor, planting the envelope, or colluding with Clara? Or was the envelope a relic of Mrs. Hargreaves's own actions, misplaced in her final days? Miss Marple thought of a village schoolteacher who had hidden a forged note, her careful planning undone by a single oversight. The envelope, she felt, was such an oversight, and she intended to unravel its meaning. She decided to visit Mr. Finch in Much Benham, to confirm the envelope's origin and probe Ernest's role further. But first, she would call on Dolly Bantry, whose sharp tongue and wide network might shed light on Ernest's visit or Clara's movements. The village, with its watchful eyes, would provide more clues, and Miss Marple, with her knack for listening, would gather them. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work piecing together the truth was in full swing. Chapter 6. Lionel's debts. The autumnal charm of St. Mary Mead persisted into late September. With the village draped in a tapestry of russet and gold, the air sharp with the promise of frost, Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage window with a cup of tea, watched the postman cycle past, her mind far from the tranquil scene. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had grown more intricate with each revelation, the strained dynamics at Hargreaves Manor. Ernest Wheeler's nervous ambition, the villagers' fervent gossip, and the torn envelope found in the study. Each clue was a thread in a complex weave, and Miss Marple, with her knack for discerning patterns, felt the truth drawing closer. Today, her focus turned to Lionel Brent, whose careless charm and rumoured debts suggested a motive as potent as any. A visit to the village tailor, Mr. Hodges, who had whispered of Lionel's financial troubles, would be her next step. Cloaked in the guise of a routine errand, Miss Marple donned a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her appearance as unassuming as a sparrow, though her purpose was anything but. She tucked her knitting into her basket, alongside the solicitor's envelope from the study, and set out for the high street, where Hodges's tailoring shop stood, its bow window displaying a smart tweed suit. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, and the air was thick with the scent of wool and starch. Mr. Hodges, a wiry man with a tape measure draped around his neck, looked up from his cutting table, his spectacles glinting in the lamplight. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice cheerful but tinged with the wariness of a man who knew the villagers' eyes were always watching. "Here for a new frock, or just a chat?" His smile was genuine, but his fingers fidgeted with a spool of thread. Betraying a restlessness Miss Marple noted with interest. "Oh, a chat, I think. Mr. Hodges," she replied, her tone light as she set her basket on the counter. "Though I might have you mend a seam or two. I was passing and thought of you such a fine tailor and so well informed about village matters." She smiled, her pale blue eyes meeting his with a warmth that invited confidences. Mr. Hodges chuckled, relaxing slightly. "You're too kind. Miss Marple, I hear things, mind you, working here. Folk talk while they're measured, and I listen." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I reckon you're here about that Hargreaves business. The will, isn't it? Village is buzzing like a hive." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "It's a sad affair, Mr. Hodges. Poor Mrs. Hargreaves, her wishes gone astray. I heard you mention Mr. Brent Leonel, that is, and some troubles he's had. Financial troubles, perhaps." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her gaze was steady. Probing for the truth behind the gossip, Mr. Hodges's eyes widened, and he glanced toward the door, as if fearing eavesdroppers. "You don't miss much, do you, Miss Marple?" I said as much to Mrs. Price last week. Lionel Brent's been in a pickle, no mistake. Came in a month ago, wanting a new suit, bespoke. Mind you, the best tweed. Said he'd pay later, but I heard from Mr. Tompkins, the butcher, that he's owing money all over bookmakers, mostly in London. Big sums, too." He shook his head, his fingers resuming their dance with the thread. "Reckon he's counting on that inheritance to bail him out." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Bookmakers, you say? How unfortunate. A young man like Lionel, so charming, but charm doesn't pay debts, does it?" She paused, letting the words settle, then added, "Do you think he might have interfered with the will to secure the whole estate?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes missed nothing the way Mr. Hodges's mouth tightened. The slight flush on his cheeks. Mr. Hodges hesitated, then shrugged. "I wouldn't put it past him, Miss Marple. He's a Brent, and they've always had a wild streak. His father, God rest him, lost a fortune at cards. Lionel's cut from the same cloth. If that will named him and Miss Tuttle equal, he might thought to tip the scales. But that's just talk, mind you. I've no proof." He busied himself with a pair of scissors, his movements brisk, as if to distance himself from the accusation. Miss Marple nodded, her lips twitching. "Talk is a curious thing, Mr. Hodges. It twists and turns, but there's often a grain of truth. Thank you for being so candid. I'll leave that seam for another day, I think." She picked up her basket, her smile as warm as ever, but her mind was racing. Lionel's debts, confirmed by the tailor, were a motive as old as time greed. Sharpened by desperation, she recalled a young clerk in St. Mary Mead who had pilfered from his employer to cover gambling losses. His easy smile a mask for panic. Lionel's laughter at the manor, she reflected, had carried a similar brittleness. Her next stop was the Red Lion, the village pub where Lionel was known to linger. The landlord, Mr. Baxter, was a jovial man with a memory for faces and conversations, and Miss Marple hoped he might corroborate Mr. Hodges's tale. She entered the pub, its low beams and polished brass creating a cozy haven from the autumn chill. The lunchtime crowd was sparse, a few farmers nursing pints. A delivery boy munching a pie, and Mr. Baxter greeted her with a broad grin. "Miss Marple, what brings you to my humble establishment?" he said, wiping the bar with a cloth. "Not here for a pint, I wager, but I've got a nice cuppa if you're inclined." His eyes twinkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath his bonhomie, and Miss Marple knew he missed little of what transpired in his pub. A cup of tea would be lovely. "Mr. Baxter," she replied, settling onto a stool at the bar. "I was hoping to ask you about Mr. Lionel Brent from the Manor. I hear he's been in some difficulty, and you know how village talk spreads. I thought you might set me straight." Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her gaze was sharp, watching for his reaction. Mr. Baxter's grin faded, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping. "You're on about that will business, aren't you, Miss Marple? Lionel's been a regular here, more's the pity. Charming lad, but he's got a taste for the horses, and they don't love him back. Last month he was in here, talking to a London fellow sharpsuit, sharper eyes, owed him a packet, from what I overheard. Lionel promised to pay up soon, said he was coming into money. Didn't sound like wages, if you catch my drift." He raised an eyebrow, his meaning clear. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her face remained serene. Coming into money. How intriguing. Did he mention the will, or Mrs. Hargreaves's estate? She sipped her tea, her movements deliberate, encouraging Mr. Baxter to elaborate. Mr. Baxter shook his head. Not in so many words, but he was cocky, like he knew something was in the bag. Said he'd be set for life once things were sorted. Mind you, he was 3 pints in, so could have been the ale talking. But I've seen men in debt before, Miss Marple, and Lionel's got that look, smiling on the outside, sweating on the inside. He wiped the bar again, his cloth moving in slow circles, as if mirroring his thoughts. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. Lionel's confidence, coupled with his debts, suggested he expected the inheritance, perhaps the whole estate, not just half. Had he taken the will to ensure it, or to delay its discovery until he could manipulate the outcome? She thought of a village shopkeeper who had burned a creditor's ledger, his bravado crumbling under scrutiny. "Debt is a heavy burden," she murmured, "and it makes men do foolish things, doesn't it?" Mr. Baxter snorted. "Foolish is right. If Lionel's mixed up in this will nonsense, he's playing a dangerous game. That estate's worth a fortune, and folks do worse than steal for it." He glanced at the farmers, lowering his voice further. "You be careful, Miss Marple. Poking about like this, you're sharper than most, but sharpness can cut both ways." Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "Oh, I'm just an old woman, Mr. Baxter, with too much time on my hands. Thank you for the T&D conversation." She left a coin on the bar and stepped into the street, her basket swinging lightly, her mind alight with possibilities. Lionel's debts were no longer mere gossip but a confirmed motive, and his talk of coming into money was a thread she intended to follow. Her thoughts were interrupted by a chance encounter with Clara Tuttle, who was hurrying along the high street, her grey coat blending with the cobblestones. Clara's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and she clutched a small parcel as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, approached with a kindly smile. "Miss Tuttle, how nice to see you. You look a bit peaky, my dear. Is everything all right?" Her voice was warm, but her eyes were watchful, noting Clara's trembling hands, and the way her gaze darted to the Manor's distant silhouette. Clara started, then forced a smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm just tired. that's all. It's been a trying time, with Mrs. Hargreaves gone and the will. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, her fingers tightening on the parcel. I was just fetching some things from the chemist. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. Of course, my dear. It must be dreadfully unsettling, all this uncertainty. I was at the manor yesterday, you know, and Mrs. Gibbs showed me the study. Such a lovely room, but that envelope most curious, wasn't it? She watched Clara closely, her tone casual, but her words deliberate, testing for a reaction. Clara's eyes widened, and her breath caught. Envelope. I don't know anything about it, Miss Marple. I haven't been in the study much, not since. She trailed off, her cheeks flushing, and Miss Marple noted the panic in her eyes, as if the mention of the envelope had struck a nerve. No matter, my dear, Miss Marple said soothingly, patting Clara's arm. I'm sure it's nothing. But I did hear about Lionel's troubles debts, they say. It must be hard, sharing the manor with him, with all this going on. Her voice was gentle, but her gaze was steady, probing for any hint of Clara's thoughts on her co-heir. Lips trembled, and she looked down at her parcel. He's been kind, Miss Marple, but he's not himself. Worried, I think, about money. He talks of plans, big plans, but I don't know what he means. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she glanced over her shoulder, as if fearing Lionel's shadow. I just want Mrs. Hargreaves's wishes honoured, that's all. Miss Marple nodded, her heart softening for the anxious woman, though her mind remained analytical. Clara's fear of Lionel, coupled with her ignorance or feigned ignorance of the envelope, suggested she was either a victim of circumstance or a careful player in the game. You're quite right, my dear, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Hargreaves' wishes are what matter. Do take care of yourself. She squeezed Clara's hand, then let her hurry away, her mind turning over the encounter. The afternoon was waning, and Miss Marple decided to visit Dolly Bantry, whose manor house offered a refuge for reflection and a chance to test her theories. The walk was brisk, the lanes lined with hedgerows, heavy with sloes. And by the time she reached Bantry Manor, her plan was clear. She would confront Lionel directly, but first, she needed Dolly's perspective on the village's undercurrents. Dolly greeted her with a cry of delight, ushering her into a drawing room where a fire roared. Jane, you're at it again, aren't you? She said, pouring tea from a silver pot. That Hargreaves' will is the talk of the county. What's the latest? Don't tell me Lionel's the villain. He's too handsome for that. Her eyes sparkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath her levity, and Miss Marple knew she could trust her friend's instincts. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the tea. Handsome or not, Dolly, Lionel's in trouble. Debts, and plenty of them. According to the tailor and the Red Lion's landlord, he's been talking of coming into money, which sounds rather ominous, don't you think? And then there's Clara, frightened as a mouse, and that envelope in the study. She recounted her day's findings, her voice soft but precise, laying out the clues like cards on a table. Dolly's eyes widened, and she set her cup down with a clink. Good heavens, Jane, you've been busy. Lionel's debts don't surprise. Me, his father, was the same, always chasing a sure thing. But taking the will, that's bold, even for a Brent. And Clara, do you think she's in on it, or just scared? She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. Clara's frightened, but whether it's of Lionel, the truth, or something else, I can't yet say. The envelope suggests someone's playing a game, hiding, accusing, or distracting. Lionel's motive is clear, but motive alone isn't proof. She paused, her eyes gleaming. I think it's time I spoke to him, Dolly. A direct approach, but gentle, you know. People reveal themselves when they're pressed, ever so slightly. Dolly laughed, clapping her hands. You're a marvel, Jane. Like a cat with a mouse, only kinder. But be careful, Lionel's charming, but charm can hide a knife. If he's desperate, he might not take kindly to your questions. She raised her cup, a mock toast to Miss Marple's quest, as Miss Marple walked home in the gathering dusk. The village lights flickering like fireflies, her mind was busy. Lionel's debts were a cornerstone of the mystery, but the envelope, Clara's fear, and Ernest's visits formed a web she was only beginning to untangle. She resolved to visit the manor again, to confront Lionel with her knowledge of his debts and watch his reaction. A village gambler, years ago, had confessed to theft when pressed, his bravado crumbling under quiet scrutiny. Lionel, she felt, might do the same. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work unraveling the truth was in full swing. Chapter 7. Clara's secret. The late September evenings in St. Mary Mead carried a gentle melancholy, with the village cloaked in twilight and the scent of fallen leaves lingering in the air. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour fire with a shawl draped over her shoulders, turned the solicitor's envelope from Hargreaves Manor's study in her hands, its broken wax seal a silent challenge. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had woven a complex tapestry. Lionel Brent's debts, Ernest Wheeler's ambition, Mrs. Gibbs's loyalty, the village's gossip, and the enigmatic envelope. Each clue deepened the puzzle. But Miss Marple's encounter with Clara Tuttle on the high street, her pale face and trembling hands, had stirred a new thread of inquiry. Clara's fear, more than mere grief, hinted at a personal stake in the will's disappearance, and Miss Marple resolved to uncover its source. A visit to the manor, under the pretense of returning a borrowed prayer book, would provide the opportunity to probe gently into Clara's past. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the village still shrouded in mist, as she donned a navy coat and a hat adorned with a single feather. Her basket, containing the prayer book and a skein of wool for appearance's sake, swung lightly as she walked the familiar path to Hargreaves Manor. The manor's Georgian facade loomed through the fog, its windows like unblinking eyes, and Miss Marple noted the continued neglect of the gardens, the rose bushes now drooping under the weight of dew. She rang the bell, and Mrs. Gibbs appeared, her angular face softening slightly at the sight of a familiar visitor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her tones civil but guarded. "Back so soon? Mr. Brent's in London today, but Miss Tuttle's about. Come in, I'll fetch her." She stepped aside, her black dress rustling as she led Miss Marple into the entrance hall, where the Hargreaves ancestors' portraits cast their stern gazes. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm. "I only came to return Miss Tuttle's prayer book. She lent it for the church reading group, you know. Such a thoughtful gesture." She held up the small, leather-bound volume, her eyes scanning the hall for new details. The mahogany table, where she had previously noted a dust-free rectangle, now held a fresh vase of chrysanthemums, their vibrant yellow a stark contrast to the hall's sombre grandeur. She filed the change away, her mind alert for its significance. Mrs. Gibbs nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'll get her. Wait in the morning room, if you please." She disappeared down a corridor, and Miss Marple followed her instructions. entering a smaller sunlit room with chintz curtains and a view of the misty gardens. The room was cozy but impersonal, its furniture polished but devoid of personal touches, as if it were rarely used. A writing desk in the corner caught Miss Marple's eye, its surface bare except for a single sheet of notepaper and an inkstand. She resisted the urge to inspect it, knowing Clara's arrival would require her full attention. Clara Tuttle entered moments later, her small figure almost swallowed by the room's proportions. Her grey dress was as nondescript as ever, and her mousy hair was pinned tightly, but her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands clutched a handkerchief with a desperation that Miss Marple noted with quiet sympathy. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Clara said, her voice soft but strained. "Mrs. Gibbs said, 'You've brought my prayer book.'" She managed a thin smile, but her gaze flickered to the door, as if expecting an intrusion. Double quotes. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said, handing over the book with a gentle pat. "It was so good of you to lend it. I thought I'd return it in person and see how you're faring. These are such trying times, with all the uncertainty at the manor." She settled into a chair, her basket on her lap, and fixed Clara with a look of kindly concern, her tone inviting confidences. Clara perched on the edge of a sofa, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. "It's difficult, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves was so good to me, and now her wishes are lost. I don't know what to think." Her voice trembled, and she looked down, her shoulders hunching as if to ward off the weight of her words. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind analytical. Clara's distress was genuine, but its depth suggested more than loyalty to her late employer. She recalled Clara's reaction on the high street, her panic at the mention of the study's envelope, and decided to probe gently, as one might test a loose stitch. "It must be a great comfort, my dear, to have been so trusted by Mrs. Hargreaves," she said. "She relied on you, didn't she? Managing her letters, her appointments, such a responsibility for a young woman." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of discomfort. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she nodded. "She did trust me, Miss Marple. I tried to be worthy of it. She was, like a mother to me, after everything." Her voice caught, and she dabbed at her eyes, her handkerchief now a crumpled ball. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression softening. "After everything, my dear, you've had your share of troubles, I imagine. Life can be unkind to those who deserve better." She paused, her tone gentle but deliberate, inviting Clara to share more. She thought of a village girl who had confided a painful secret under similar encouragement, her trust won by quiet understanding. Clara's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of retreat. But Miss Marple's steady gaze, warm yet unyielding, held her, and she took a shaky breath. I haven't told anyone here, Miss Marple. Not even Mrs. Hargreaves, not fully. But you're so kind, and I need to tell someone." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. "I was engaged, years ago, to a man named Robert Langley. He seemed so respectable, a merchant's son, with plans for a shop in Bristol. My family, my parents, my brother, they trusted him, gave him their savings to invest in his business. But she choked, her hands clenching the handkerchief. Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand. "He betrayed you, didn't he, my dear?" she said softly, her voice a bomb. "It's a hard thing, to trust and be deceived." Her mind raced, fitting this revelation into the puzzle. A past betrayal could explain Clara's timidity, her fear of losing her place at the manor, and perhaps her actions regarding the will. Clara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. He took everything, Miss Marple. The savings, my father's. Pension all gone. He disappeared, left me to face the shame. My family never recovered. Father died soon after, and mother, she blamed me. I had nowhere to go until Mrs. Hargreaves took me in. She knew something of Itrobert's name, the scandal, but not the details. She never asked, just gave me a home. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her handkerchief, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's heart ached for the young woman, but her mind remained clear, analyzing the implications. Clara's past, marked by betrayal and loss, made her vulnerable both to fear of poverty and to manipulation. Had someone, perhaps Lionel or Ernest, used her history to pressure her into hiding the will? Or had Clara, desperate to secure her inheritance, taken it herself? Miss Marple thought of a village widow who had concealed a stolen deed, her fear of destitution driving her to deceit. "You've carried a heavy burden, my dear," she said gently. "But Mrs. Hargreaves trusted you, and that trust is your strength. Did she ever speak of her will, of what she intended for you?" Clara looked up, her eyes red but clearer. "She said I'd be provided for, Miss Marple, that I'd have a home, a future. She knew I had nothing else, but with the will gone." Her voice faltered, and she glanced at the window, as if the misty gardens held answers. "Lionel says we'll share, but he's so reckless. I'm afraid he'll lose it all, and I'll be left with nothing again." Her words were laced with dread, and Miss Marple noted the intensity of her fear, as if Lionel's debts were a personal threat. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Lionel's troubles are no secret, my dear. Debts can make a man desperate, can't they? But you mustn't let fear cloud your judgment. The will, when it's found, will set things right." She paused, her tone shifting to a lighter note. "I was in the study the other day, you know, with Mrs. Gibbs. That envelope from Mr. Finch's office, most curious, wasn't it? Hidden under the blotter, as if someone meant to keep it secret." She watched Clara closely, her words a gentle probe, testing for a reaction. Clara's breath hitched, and her hands froze on the handkerchief. "The envelope, I don't know anything about it, Miss Marple. I haven't been in the study, not since Mrs. Hargreaves." Her voice was too quick, her eyes too wide, and Miss Marple noted the panic, as if the mention of the envelope had struck a nerve. "I mean, I write letters there sometimes, but not lately. I wouldn't hide anything." Her words tumbled out, and she looked away, her cheeks flushing. Miss Marple smiled, her expression unchanged. "Of course, my dear, it's only a puzzle, isn't it? Things turn up in the oddest places." She patted Clara's hand again, her mind cataloguing the young woman's reaction. Clara's denial was vehement, but her fear suggested knowledge or guilt. Had she hidden the envelope, perhaps to protect her inheritance, or was she covering for someone else? Miss Marple thought of Ernest Wheeler's visit to the manor, his lingering chat with Clara in the garden. Could they be connected, bound by a shared secret? The conversation turned to lighter matters, the church, bazaar, the weather, but Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Clara's past explained her anxiety, but her reaction to the envelope raised questions. She needed to know more about Clara's interactions with Lionel and Ernest, and whether her fear of poverty had driven her to act. As Clara excused herself, citing a headache, Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand. "Do rest, my dear," she said, "and don't worry too much. Things have a way of sorting themselves out. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were sharp. Noting Clara's hurried retreat, Mrs. Gibbs reappeared to escort her out, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "Mrs. Gibbs, you've been so kind," she said, pausing in the entrance hall. "I was wondering Miss Tuttle seems so fragile just now. Did she ever mention a past trouble, perhaps a disappointment? It might help to understand her state of mind." Her tone was casual, but her gaze was steady, probing for any hint of the housekeeper's knowledge. Mrs. Gibbs's lips tightened, and she crossed her arms. "Miss Tuttle keeps to herself, Miss Marple. She mentioned a family loss once, but nothing more. Mrs. Hargreaves took her in, and that's all I know. She's loyal, I'll say that, but she's scared of her own shadow." Her voice was flat, but there was a glint in her eyes, as if she suspected more than she said. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Loyalty is a fine thing, isn't it? Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs. I'll see myself out." She stepped into the mist, the envelope still in her basket, and felt the housekeeper's gaze on her back until the door closed as she walked back to the village. The manor fading into the fog, Miss Marple's thoughts were alive with possibilities. Clara's secreter betrayed engagement. A family ruined gave her a motive as compelling as Lionel's debts. Her fear of losing her inheritance, coupled with her access to the study, made her a potential player in the will's disappearance. But her panic over the envelope suggested she was either guilty or protecting someone else. Miss Marple thought of a village girl who had hidden a stolen ring, her loyalty to a lover her downfall. Clara, she felt, was caught in a similar web, and the key lay in her connections to Lionel and Ernest. She decided to visit Dolly Bantry, whose sharp wit might offer perspective on Clara's past and its implications. The walk to Bantry Manor was brisk, the lanes lined with hawthorn, and by the time she arrived, her plan was clear. She would verify Clara's story, perhaps through the village's older residents, and probe Ernest's role further. Dolly greeted her with a laugh, ushering her into a drawing room where a tea tray waited. "Jane, you're incorrigible," Dolly said, pouring tea. "What's the latest on that will? Don't tell me Clara's the mastermind. She's too mousy for that." Her eyes sparkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath her levity, and Miss Marple knew she could trust her friend's instincts. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the tea. "Mousy, perhaps, but mice can be clever, Dolly. Clara's told me a sad tale. Broken engagement, a family ruined. It's made her fearful, and fear can drive one to desperate acts. That envelope in the study, she knows more than she says." She recounted her visit, her voice soft but precise, laying out the clues like stitches in a pattern. Dolly's eyes widened, and she set her cup down. "Good heavens, Jane, that's a story. Clara, a jilted fiancé. It explains her nerves. But hiding the will, that's a leap. And what about Lionel, or that clerk, Wheeler? You think she's covering for one of them?" She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "Covering or caught, Dolly? Clara's fear of Lionel is real. But Ernest's visit to the manor, his talk with her in the garden, it's too convenient. I need to know more about their connection, and whether her past has left her vulnerable to manipulation." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "I'll speak to the older folk in the village, Mrs. Price's mother, perhaps. She remembers scandals from decades past. And I'll watch Ernest closely. He's a thread I haven't fully pulled." Dolly laughed, clapping her hands. "You're a marvel, Jane, like a spider in a web, catching every fly. But be careful, secrets like Clara's can make people dangerous, especially if they're cornered. She raised her cup, a mock toast to Miss Marple's quest, as Miss Marple walked home in the deepening twilight. The village lights glowing softly, her mind was busy. Clara's secret was a cornerstone of the mystery, but its implications, fear, loyalty, or collusion, were unclear. She resolved to verify Clara's story and investigate her ties to Ernest, perhaps through the Much Benham post office, where his parcels had been noted. A village scandal, years ago, had unraveled when a betrayed woman's letters revealed her lover's theft. Clara, Miss Marple felt, held a similar key, and she would find it. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work unraveling the truth was in full swing. Chapter 8. Ernest's Ambition. The twilight of St. Mary Mead was a gentle affair, with the village settling into a hush as stars pricked the velvet sky. Miss Jane Marple, her parlour aglow with the soft light of a single lamp, sat with her knitting, the click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had grown ever more intricate. Lionel Brent's debts, Clara Tuttle's painful past, Mrs. Gibbs's fierce loyalty, the village's whispered theories, and the solicitor's envelope hidden in the study. Each revelation was a stitch in a complex pattern, but Ernest Wheeler, the solicitor's clerk, had emerged as a figure of particular interest. His nervous demeanour at Finch's office, his lingering visit to the manor, and the gossip about his London parcels suggested a young man with ambitions that outstripped his station. Miss Marple resolved to probe deeper, and a chance invitation to tea at the vicarage, where Ernest was known to deliver papers, offered the perfect opportunity. The following morning dawned with a crisp clarity, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the village green. Miss Marple donned a woolen dress in soft grey and a hat adorned with a sprig of heather, her appearance as unthreatening as a dove, though her purpose was razor sharp. Her basket, containing a few parish newsletters and the solicitor's envelope, for reference, swung lightly as she made her way to the vicarage, a rambling Georgian house nestled beside the church. The vicarage was a hub of village activity, and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had a knack for drawing out confidences from even the most reticent visitors. Miss Marple hoped Ernest's presence, however brief, would yield clues to his motives. Mrs. Clement greeted her at the door, her cheeks flushed from the morning's baking. "Jane, what a delight," she said, ushering her into a cosy drawing room where a fire crackled. "I've got the kettle on, and I've asked young Mr. Wheeler to drop by with some papers for the vicar. He's such a polite boy, but so nervy, makes me want to feed him a scone and tell him to relax." She laughed, but her eyes were shrewd, and Miss Marple knew she missed little of the village's undercurrents. "How thoughtful of you, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chintz-covered armchair, her basket at her feet. "Mr. Wheeler does seem a diligent young man, doesn't he? Though I imagine a clerk's life is rather confining for someone with aspirations." Her tone was light, but her eyes gleamed, inviting Mrs. Clement to share any observations. Mrs. Clement nodded, pouring tea from a silver pot. "Oh, he's diligent, all right, but there's a restlessness about him, Jane, always fidgeting, checking his watch. Last time he was here, he talked about wanting his own practice one day, in London, no less. Ambitious, I thought, for a clerk from Much Benham." She paused, her brow furrowing. "Mind you, with that Hargreaves will missing, folk are whispering about him. Mrs. Price says he's been sending parcels to London ad for a clerk, don't you think?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild curiosity. Parcels, indeed. How intriguing. Ambition is a powerful thing, isn't it? It can lift a man, abhor, lead him astray. She thought of a village lad who had stolen to fund his dreams of a city career, his ambition a spark that burned too brightly. Ernest's nervous energy, she reflected, carried a similar heat, and she intended to test its source. The doorbell chimed, and Mrs. Clement bustled out, returning with Ernest Wheeler in tow. He was, as Miss Marple remembered, sallow with dark hair slicked back and eyes that darted like a cornered fox. His suit was neatly pressed, but the cuffs were frayed, and his hands, clutching a folder of papers, betrayed a faint tremor. He nodded politely, his voice thin but controlled. "Good morning, Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple. I've brought the deeds for the churchyard, as the vicar asked." He set the folder on a table, his movements precise but hurried, as if eager to depart. "How kind of you, Mr. Wheeler," Miss Marple said, her smile warm but her gaze piercing. "Do sit for a moment and have some tea. A clerk's life must be so busy, and you've come all the way from Much Benham." She gestured to a chair, her tone inviting but firm, leaving little room for refusal. Ernest hesitated, then sat, perching on the edge, as if poised for flight. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, accepting a cup from Mrs. Clement. "It's no trouble, really, just doing my job." His eyes flicked to the door, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, as if he carried a weight he dared not. "Share," Mrs. Clement, sensing the moment, excused herself to check the oven, leaving Miss Marple and Ernest alone. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, her voice soft but deliberate. "You must see such interesting things in your work, Mr. Wheeler," she said, stirring her tea. "All those important documents, like Mrs. Hargreaves's will. It's a great responsibility, isn't it, keeping them safe?" She watched him closely, her words a gentle probe, testing for a reaction. Ernest's cup rattled against its saucer, and he set it down hastily. "Yes, ma'am, it is," he said, his voice tight. "Mr. Finch trusts me to manage things properly. That willet was in the safe, locked tight, until it wasn't." His eyes met hers briefly, then dropped to his hands, which were now twisting a napkin. "I don't know how it happened, honest." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind analytical. "Of course, my dear boy. These things are so puzzling, aren't they? A safe is such a secure place, and yet keys can be misplaced, can't they?" She paused, her tone shifting to a lighter note. "I was at the manor the other day, you know, and Mrs. Gibbs found an envelope from your office, hidden in the study. Most curious, don't you think?" She drew the envelope from her basket, holding it up as if it were a mere curiosity. But her eyes were locked on Ernest's face. His cheeks paled, and his hands froze on the napkin. "An envelope," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know anything about that, Miss Marple. I deliver papers, that's all. If it's from our office, maybe Mrs. Hargreaves kept it." His words were quick, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the bead of sweat on his brow, despite the room's coolness. She smiled, undeterred. Perhaps, but it's odd, isn't it, hidden under a blotter, as if someone meant to keep it secret. You were at the manor, I hear, not long before Mrs. Hargreaves passed. Delivering papers, Mrs. Gibbs said, and chatting with Miss Tuttle in the garden. Such a pleasant place, the manor. Her tone was conversational, but her words were a net, drawing tighter with each syllable. Ernest's eyes widened, and he coughed, clearing his throat. "Just routine, ma'am," he said, his voice strained. "Mrs. Hargreaves needed some documents signed, and Miss Tuttleshee was kind, offered me a glass of lemonade. Nothing more." He glanced at the clock, his fingers resuming their restless dance. "I should be getting back. Mr. Finch will be expecting me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, my dear boy, you're so diligent. But ambition is a fine thing, isn't it? Mrs. Clement mentioned you dream of your own practice one day. London, perhaps. It must be exciting, planning for such a future." Her voice was warm, but her gaze was unrelenting, watching as Ernest's flush deepened. He forced a smile, his teeth bared like a cornered animal's. "A dream, ma'am, that's all. Takes money, and I'm just a clerk. I work hard, stay loyal to Mr. Finch." His words were clipped, and he rose, smoothing his jacket. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. I'll tell the vicar the papers are here." He nodded curtly and hurried out, leaving his cup half full and the napkin crumpled on the table. Mrs. Clement returned, her brow raised. "Goodness, Jane, you've scared him off. He looked like a rabbit bolting for cover. What did you say?" She settled into a chair, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Miss Marple smiled, tucking the envelope back into her basket. "Only a few questions, my dear, about the will and his visits to the manor. Young Mr. Wheeler is ambitious, but ambition can be a restless bedfellow, can't it? He knows more than he says, I'm sure of it." She sipped her tea, her mind racing. Ernest's reaction to the envelope panic, followed by denial, was telling, as was his haste to dismiss his talk with Clara. She thought of a village boy who had stolen to fund a new life, his guilt betrayed by the same nervous tics. Ernest, she felt, was hiding something, and it was tied to the manor. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the vicarage door, and Mrs. Clement excused herself to answer it. Miss Marple, left alone, rose and approached the table where Ernest had left the folder. She didn't touch it. Such an act would be improper, but her eyes scanned the papers visible through the open flap. They were routine deeds, as he'd said, but a small note in his handwriting caught her attention. "Check LB accounts, urgent." The initials, she deduced, likely stood for Lionel Brent, and the word urgent suggested a connection to Lionel's debt sore, something more. She filed the detail away, her mind turning over its implications. Mrs. Clement returned, her face alight with news. That was Mrs. Price, Jane, with more gossip. "She says Ernest was seen at the Much Benham station yesterday, buying a ticket to London again. Third time this month, her nephew says. Now, what's he up to, dashing off like that?" She folded her arms, her expression one of delighted indignation. Miss Marple's lips twitched, not quite a smile. London, indeed. How curious. A young man with ambitions might seek opportunities their raw allies. She thought of Ernest's parcels, mentioned by Mrs. Price, and wondered if they were linked to his trips. Were they documents, perhaps, related to the will, or something else entirely? She recalled a village postman who had smuggled stolen goods to a London fence, his frequent trips his undoing. Ernest's movements, she felt, were a thread to follow. She rose, thanking Mrs. Clement for the tea. "You've been most helpful, my dear," she said, her smile warm. "I think I'll take a stroll to the station, see if the station master has noticed anything about Mr. Wheeler's travels. Small details, you know, can be so revealing." She adjusted her hat, her basket in hand, and stepped into the morning. Light, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The walk to the St. Mary Mead station was short, the lanes lined with blackberry bushes heavy with fruit. The station master, Mr. Griggs, was a grizzled man with a memory for passengers, and Miss Marple found him polishing the ticket counter, his cap askew. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "Not off to London, I hope?" "Oh no, Mr. Griggs," she replied, her smile disarming. "Just a bit of village business. I hear young Mr. Wheeler from Much Benham has been travelling to London lately. Such an enterprising lad. Have you noticed him at the station?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any hint of recognition. Mr. Griggs nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. I've seen him 3 times this month, like clockwork. Always buys a return ticket, but he's in a hurry, checking his watch, looking over his shoulder. Carries a small case, too not big enough for clothes, mind you. More like papers, or something valuable." He scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Reckon he's up to something, Miss Marple. Folk don't rush to London that often unless there's money in it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Money, indeed. Thank you, Mr. Griggs. You've been most helpful." She left the station, her mind alight with the station master's words. Ernest's trips, his case, and his note about Lionel's. Accounts suggested a scheme, perhaps blackmail, forgery, or a plan to profit from the will's absence. She thought of Clara's fear, Lionel's debts, and the envelope's hidden presence. Ernest, with his access to both the manor and the solicitor's safe, was a linchpin, and she intended to test his mettle further. Her next step was to visit Dolly Bantry, whose sharp tongue and wide network might offer insight into Ernest's London connections. The walk to Bantry Manor was brisk, the autumn air invigorating, and by the time she arrived, her plan was clear. She would verify Ernest's movements and probe his ties to Clara and Lionel. Dolly greeted her with a laugh, ushering her into a drawing room where a tea tray waited. "Jane, you're at it again," Dolly said, pouring tea. "What's the latest on that will? Don't tell me that clerk's the mastermind. He's too jumpy for that." Her eyes sparkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath her levity, and Miss Marple knew she could trust her friend's instincts. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the tea. Jumpy but clever, Dolly, Ernest, Wheeler's ambitious, and ambition can be a dangerous thing. He's been to London, carrying a case, and he's hiding something about that envelope in the study. I think he's tied to Clara, or Lionel, or both. She recounted her morning, her voice soft but precise, laying out the clues like stitches in a pattern. Dolly's eyes widened, and she set her cup down. "Good heavens, Jane, that's a tale. Ernest, a schemer. It fits, with those shifty eyes. And London, do you think he's selling the will, or worse? What about Clara? She's so timid, but you said she's got secrets." She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "Clara's secrets make her vulnerable, Dolly, and Ernest's ambition makes him bold. I need to know what he's carrying to London, and whether Clara's fear is of him or for him. I'll speak to Mrs. Price's nephew at the Much Benham post office. Those parcels might hold the key." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "Ernest's a thread I'm pulling, Dolly, and I think it's about to unravel." Dolly laughed, clapping her hands. "You're a marvel, Jane, like a bloodhound in a bonnet. But be careful. Ambition like that can turn nasty, especially if he's cornered." She raised her cup, a mock toast to Miss Marple's quest, as Miss Marple walked home in the gathering dusk, the village lights twinkling softly. Her mind was busy. Ernest's ambition was a cornerstone of the mystery, but its shape, blackmail, theft, or collusion, was unclear. She resolved to investigate his parcels and his ties to Clara, perhaps through the post office or a return visit to the manor. A village scandal, years ago, had unraveled when a clerk's letters revealed his theft. Ernest, Miss Marple felt, held a similar key, and she would find it. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her work unraveling the truth was in full swing. Chapter 9. The false trail. The autumn chill had settled over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a mantle of frost that glittered under the morning sun. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out at the mist curling over her garden, her mind far from the tranquil scene. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had woven a web of intrigue. Lionel Brent's debts, Clara Tuttle's betrayed past, Mrs. Gibbs' steadfast loyalty, Ernest Wheeler's restless ambition, and the solicitor's envelope hidden in the study. Each clue deepened the puzzle, but Ernest's nervous denials and London trips had sharpened Miss Marple's focus on his role. Yet a new whisper, overheard at the village shop, had shifted her attention. Clara Tuttle, seen near the solicitor's office in Much Benham the night the will vanished, was now the subject of fervent speculation. Miss Marple, with her knack for sifting truth from rumour, resolved to investigate this lead, suspecting it might be a false trail laid to obscure the real culprit. A visit to the manor, under the guise of delivering a church knitting pattern, would allow her to probe Clara's movements and test the villagers' latest theory. Miss Marple donned a woolen coat in muted plum and a hat with a single silk rose, her appearance as unassuming as ever, though her purpose was keen. Her basket, containing the knitting pattern and a few parish newsletters for plausibility, swung lightly as she walked to Hargreaves Manor, the frosty path crunching under her sensible shoes. The manor's Georgian facade loomed through the mist, its ivy-clad walls sombre against the pale sky, and Miss Marple noted the continued neglect of the grounds, the lawns now patched with fallen leaves. She rang the bell, and Mrs. Gibbs appeared, her angular face set in its usual mask of professional courtesy, though her eyes held a glint of wariness. "Good morning, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and deferential. "I've brought a knitting pattern for Miss Tuttle. She expressed an interest at the church bazaar, you know. Such a soothing hobby in troubled times." She held up her basket, her smile disarming, though her gaze was alert, scanning the housekeeper's expression for any hint of suspicion. Mrs. Gibbs's lips twitched, as if weighing the pretext. "Miss Tuttle's in the morning room, Miss Marple. Come in, I'll fetch her. Mr. Brent's out, as usual." Her tone was clipped, but she stepped aside, leading Miss Marple through the entrance hall, where the Hargreaves ancestors' portraits cast their stern gazes. The mahogany table, now free of flowers, bore a faint ring where the vase had stood, a detail Miss Marple filed away as evidence of recent activity in the morning room. With its chintz, curtains, and view of the misty gardens, Miss Marple settled into a chair, her basket on her lap. The room was as impersonal as before, but a small fire in the grate lent a touch of warmth, and the writing desk in the corner now held a stack of letters, their envelopes bearing Clara's precise handwriting. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on them, noting the absence of the solicitor's crest, before turning her attention to the door as Clara entered. Clara Tuttle's small figure seemed even more diminished today, her grey dress blending with the room's shadows. Her mousy hair was pinned tightly, and her hands, clutching a shawl, betrayed a faint tremor. Her eyes, red-rimmed as if from sleepless nights, met Miss Marple's with a flicker of apprehension. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," she said, her voice soft but strained. Mrs. Gibbs mentioned a knitting pattern. She perched on a sofa, her posture rigid, as if bracing for an ordeal. "Yes." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, drawing the pattern from her basket with a gentle smile. "I thought you might enjoy this. It's a simple scarf, but so rewarding. And I wanted to see how you're managing with all this uncertainty about the will." She handed over the pattern, her tone warm but probing, inviting Clara to share her burdens. Clara's fingers tightened on the paper, and she managed a thin smile. "It's difficult, Miss Marple. I try to keep busy, but the waiting, the not knowing, it's hard." Her voice trembled, and she looked down, her shawl slipping slightly to reveal a nervous twist of her hands. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind analytical. Clara's distress was palpable, but the village's latest rumor that she had been seen near Finch's office suggested either guilt or a deliberate attempt to cast suspicion on her. She decided to probe gently, as one might test a fragile seam. "It must be a great strain, my dear," she said. "I was in the village yesterday, and there's such talk so unkind, sometimes. I heard someone say you were seen in Much Benham, near Mr. Finch's office, the night the will went missing. Isn't that curious, how stories spread?" Her voice was light, almost gossipy, but her eyes were sharp. Watching Clara's reaction, Clara's breath caught, and her hands froze on the shawl. Her face paled, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapse. "Much Benham," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I was there, Miss Marple, but not for anything wrong. I swear it." Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned forward, her words tumbling out. "I went to see Mr. Finch to ask about my share of the estate. I was so afraid, with Lionel's debts, that I'd lose everything. But the office was locked closed for the evening. I didn't even go. Inside," her voice rose, laced with panic, and she clutched the shawl as if it could shield her from the accusation. Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand with a soothing gesture. There, my dear. No need to upset yourself," she said, her voice a balm. "I'm sure it was perfectly innocent. But it's odd, isn't it, that someone saw you, almost as if they wanted you to be seen." She paused, her tone shifting to a thoughtful note. "Who knew you were going to Much Benham, my dear? Did you tell anyone?" Her eyes, behind their mild facade, were unrelenting, searching for any hint of deception. Clara shook her head, her tears spilling over. "No one, Miss Marple. I didn't tell a soul. I went after supper, when Lionel was at the Red Lion and Mrs. Gibbs was in the kitchen. I took the late bus, thinking no one would notice, but someone must have." She trailed off, her eyes widening with a sudden realization. "Do you think someone followed me? To make it look like I took the will?" Her voice was a mix of fear and indignation, and Miss Marple noted the shift as if Clara's own words had crystallized a new fear. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It's possible, my dear. People can be so cunning, can't they? Setting a false trail to hide their own tracks." She thought of a village scandal years ago when a maid had been falsely accused of theft. Her presence at a shop deliberately noted to deflect suspicion from the true culprit. Clara's trip to Much Benham, she suspected, was such a trail, laid by someone with access to her movements, Lionel, Ernest, or even Mrs. Gibbs. What time did you go, my dear? It might help to piece things together. Clara dabbed at her eyes, her voice steadier now. It was about 8 o'clock, Miss Marple. The bus left at 7:30, and I was in Much Benham by 8. I walked to Mr. Finch's office, but it was dark, so I turned back and caught the 9 o'clock bus home. I was back at the manor by 10, before Lionel returned. Her words were precise, as if she had replayed the evening in her mind, and Miss Marple noted the clarity, suggesting truth or a well-rehearsed story. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clara's timeline placed her in Much Benham after the solicitor's office closed, and the will, according to Mr. Finch, had been missing by the next morning's reading. If Clara was telling the truth, her visit was coincidental, but her visibility suggested someone had orchestrated the sighting. She recalled Ernest's nervous trips to London and his lingering chat with Clara at the manor. Had he followed her, or tipped off a village gossip? Or was Lionel, with his debts and reckless confidence, deflecting suspicion onto his co-heir? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Gibbs's sharp eyes, always watching, and wondered if the housekeeper had played a role. She shifted the conversation to lighter matters, the knitting pattern, the upcoming harvest festival, watching as Clara relaxed, her hands loosening on the shawl. But Miss Marple's thoughts were busy, piecing together the timeline. If Clara's visit was a false trail, the real theft had likely occurred earlier, perhaps during Ernest's visit to the manor or within Finch's office. She needed to verify Clara's story, perhaps through the Much Benham bus driver or the village gossip who had reported the sighting. "You've been so brave, my dear," she said, rising with her basket. "Don't let these rumors trouble you. The truth has a way of coming out." Her smile was warm, but her eyes were resolute. Planning her next move, Mrs. Gibbs reappeared to escort her out, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "Mrs. Gibbs, you're always so busy," she said, pausing in the entrance hall. "Did you notice Miss Tuttle going out that evening, about a week ago, when the will went missing? She mentioned a trip to Much Benham, but I'm sure you'd have seen her leave." Her tone was casual, but her gaze was steady, probing for any sign of knowledge. Mrs. Gibbs's lips tightened, and she crossed her arms. "Miss Tuttle's comings and goings aren't my concern, Miss Marple, unless they affect the household. I was in the kitchen that evening, cleaning up after supper. Didn't see her leave, but I heard the front door around 8. Thought it was Mr. Brent, but he was at the pub." Her voice was flat, but there was a glint in her eyes, as if she resented the question or the implication. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Of course, Mrs. Gibbs, you've so much to manage. Thank you for your time." She stepped into the frosty air, the manor fading into the mist, and felt the housekeeper's gaze on her back until the door closed as she walked back to the village. Her mind was alight with possibilities. Clara's trip to Much Benham, if true, was a cleverly laid distraction, designed to cast suspicion on her while the real thief operated unseen. Mrs. Gibbs's vague recollection of the door suggested she was either uninvolved or deliberately obtuse, and Miss Marple leaned toward the latter, given the housekeeper's sharp observation. Ernest, with his access to the solicitor's safe and his manor visits, remained a prime suspect, but Lionel's debts and reckless talk of coming into money could not be ignored. She thought of a village theft years ago, when a false accusation against a gardener had masked the butler's crime, the truth emerging only through careful timing. Clara's story, she felt, was a similar misdirection, and she intended to unravel its source. Her next step was to visit Dolly Bantry, whose sharp wit and county connections might shed light on the gossip's origin or Ernest's movements. The walk to Bantry Manor was invigorating, the lanes lined with frosted hedgerows, and by the time she arrived, her plan was clear. She would verify Clara's timeline and trace the rumors spread, perhaps through Mrs. Price's network. Dolly greeted her with a cry of delight, ushering her into a drawing room where a fire roared. "Jane, you're incorrigible," Dolly said, pouring tea from a silver pot. "What's the latest on that, Will? Don't tell me Clara's the thief. She's too fragile for that." Her eyes sparkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath her levity, and Miss Marple knew she could trust her friend's instincts. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the tea. "Fragile, but not helpless, Dolly. Clara was in Much Benham the night that Will vanished, but I think it's a false trail laid to make her look guilty. Someone wanted her seen, and I need to know who." She recounted her visit, her voice soft but precise, laying out the clues like stitches in a pattern. Dolly's eyes widened, and she set her cup down with a clink. "Good heavens, Jane, that's clever. A setup, you mean? But who Lionel to? Get the whole estate? Or that clerk Wheeler, with his sneaky trips to London? And what about Mrs. Gibbs? She's like a hawk, watching everything." She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Gibbs sees more than she says, Dolly, but I think she's protecting the manor, not the thief. Ernest's the key. I suspect his ambition, his access, his nerves. But Lionel's not out of it, with his debts piling up. I need to check Clara's story with the bus driver and find out who spread that rumor. It's a thread I'm pulling, and it's starting to unravel." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "I'll visit Mrs. Price's nephew at the Much Benham post office. Those parcels of Ernest's might tie in." Dolly laughed, clapping her hands. "You're a marvel, Jane, like a cat stalking a mouse, only politer. But be careful, false trails mean someone's clever, and clever people don't like being caught." She raised her cup, a mock toast, to Miss Marple's quest. As Miss Marple walked home in the deepening frost, the village lights glowing softly, her mind was busy. The false trail against Clara was a deliberate act, but its architect Ernest, Lionel, or an unseen player remained elusive. She resolved to verify Clara's timeline and trace the rumor's source, perhaps through the village shop or the post office. A village scandal, years ago, had unraveled when a false witness was exposed, the truth hidden in the timing of a lie. Clara's sighting, Miss Marple felt, held a similar key, and she would find it. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work unraveling the truth was in full swing. Chapter 10. The solicitor's safe. The frost of late September clung to St. Mary Mead, silvering the village's cobblestones and lending a crystalline edge to the morning air. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a boiled egg, gazed out at the mist-wreathed garden, her thoughts far from the serene tableau. The mystery of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves's missing will had grown ever more tangled. Lionel, Brent's reckless debts, Clara Tuttle's betrayed past, Mrs. Gibbs's watchful loyalty, Ernest Wheeler's furtive ambition, the hidden envelope in the study, and the false trail of Clara's Much Benham sighting. Each clue was a thread in a delicate web, and Miss Marple, with her knack for untangling knots, sensed the truth drawing near. The villagers' whispers about Ernest's London, parcels, and Clara's supposed guilt had sharpened her focus on the solicitor's office in Much Benham, where the will had last been seen. A visit to Mr. Finch, under the pretense of inquiring about a church bequest, would allow her to inspect the safe and probe Ernest's role further, testing the threads of suspicion that now pointed firmly in his direction. Miss Marple, a tweed coat in soft heather, and a hat with a modest pheasant feather, her appearance as unthreatening as a village spinster's, though her mind was as keen as a blade. Her basket, containing a few parish newsletters and the solicitor's envelope for reference, swung lightly as she caught the mid-morning bus to Much Benham, the market town bustling with farmers' carts and shop-girls hurrying to their counters. The offices of Finch and Sons stood on the high street, its Georgian facade polished but sombre, and Miss Marple climbed the steps with a determined air, her basket a shield of respectability. The waiting room was as she remembered, with the scent of wax polish and a filing cabinet that still stood slightly ajar. The receptionist, Miss Carter, looked up from her typewriter, her fingers pausing mid-clap. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice brisk but polite. "Back again. Do you have an appointment?" "Oh no, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm and disarming. "I'm here on a small matter for the St. Mary Mead. Church a question about bequests, you know. I hoped Mr. Finch might spare a moment. I shan't be long." She adjusted her shawl, her eyes scanning the room for new details. Coat rack now bearing a scarf as well as Ernest's trilby, and a faint scuff on the floor near the inner office door, as if something heavy had been dragged. She filed these away, her mind alert for their significance. Miss Carter hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see if he's free. Please wait here." She disappeared through the door marked P. Finch, ESQ, and Miss Marple settled onto a chair, her basket on her lap. Her ears, sharp despite her years, caught the low murmur of voices within Mr. Finch's measured tones and Ernest's higher, more agitated pitch. The words were indistinct, but the tension was palpable, and Miss Marple's lips twitched, sensing a conversation that might bear fruit. Miss Carter returned, her expression neutral. "Mr. Finch will see you now, Miss Marple. This way, please." She led her into the spacious office, where Mr. Percival Finch rose from behind his cluttered desk, his florid face creased with a polite but strained smile. Ernest Wheeler stood nearby, his sallow complexion paler than usual, his hands fidgeting with a pen. His eyes darted to Miss Marple, then away, and she noted the bead of sweat on his brow. Despite the room's chill, "Miss Marple, a pleasure," Mr. Finch said, extending a hand. "You're here about a church bequest, I understand. Do sit down." His voice was hearty, but his spectacles slipped slightly, betraying a distraction Miss Marple recognized as unease. He gestured to a chair, and she settled into it, her basket at her feet, her gaze moving between the solicitor and his clerk. "Yes, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone gentle but purposeful. "The St. Mary Mead Church is hoping to restore its organ, and we're exploring bequests from generous souls like Mrs. Hargreaves. Such a sad business, her will going missing. I thought I might ask how the search progresses purely to reassure the village, you understand." She smiled, her pale blue eyes mild but unrelenting, watching as Mr. Finch adjusted his tie and Ernest shifted his weight. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Most unfortunate, Miss Marple, most unfortunate. We've turned the office upside down, but the will's still missing. It was in my safe." He gestured to a heavy iron safe in the corner, its door gleaming with a brass lock secure as Fort Knox, until it wasn't. "Ernest checked it last, didn't you, lad?" His tone was firm, but there was a note of doubt, as if he were testing his clerk's reliability. Ernest nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice thin but controlled. "I locked it in the safe 2 weeks before the reading, after Mrs. Hargreaves reviewed it. The key was in the desk, as always, until it went missing." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then down to the pen, which he now twisted with a nervous intensity. She noted the precision of his words, as if rehearsed, and the faint tremor in his hands betraying a deeper agitation. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly curiosity. "How extraordinary," she said. "A safe is such a fortress, isn't it? And yet keys are such small things, so easily misplaced or taken." She paused, her tone shifting to a lighter note. "I was at the manor recently, you know, and Mrs. Gibbs found an envelope from your office, hidden in the study. Most curious, don't you think?" She drew the envelope from her basket, holding it up as if it were a mere trifle. But her eyes were locked on Ernest's face, watching as his pallor deepened and his pen stilled. Mr. Finch's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his spectacles glinting. "An envelope from my office. That's news to me, Miss Marple." "May I see it?" He reached for it, and Miss Marple handed it over, her smile unchanged but her mind racing. She noted Ernest's frozen posture, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it were a snake. Mr. Finch examined it, his fingers tracing the broken wax seal. "This is ours, no question," he said, his voice tight. "But empty, you say? Hidden in the study? That's irregular, to say the least." He glanced at Ernest, his expression hardening. "Wheeler, do you know anything about this? You delivered papers to the manor, didn't you?" Ernest's flush was instant, and he stammered, I don't, sir. I took documents for Mrs. Hargreaves to sign, that's all. Routine business. I never left anything like that." His voice was too quick, his eyes avoiding both Mr. Finch and Miss Marple, and she noted the sweat now visible on his temples, a telltale sign of guilt or fear. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind analytical. "Of course, Mr. Wheeler, it's only a puzzle, isn't it? Things turn up in the oddest places." She turned to Mr. Finch, her tone gentle but probing. "Might I see the safe, Mr. Finch, just to understand how such a thing could happen? It would set the villagers' minds at ease, knowing you've done all you can." Her request was bold, but her smile was so disarming, her demeanor so innocuous, that Mr. Finch hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Very well, Miss Marple," he said, rising with a sigh. "No harm in it, I suppose. The safe's right here." He led her to the iron box, its brass lock gleaming under the office's lamplight. Ernest followed, his steps reluctant, and Miss Marple noted his clenched fists as if he were bracing for a blow. Mr. Finch unlocked the safe with a key from his pocket, revealing a neat array of folders, ledgers, and sealed envelopes. "This is where the will was kept," he said, pointing to a shelf. "Locked every night, checked every morning. Ernest has access, of course, but only under my supervision." His tone was defensive, as if anticipating blame, and he glanced at his clerk, who stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the safe's contents. Miss Marple peered inside, her gaze lingering on a small crumpled note tucked behind a folder, its edge just visible. She didn't touch it, such an act would be improper, but she squinted, making out the words, "Meet me at the manor, midnight," in a hurried scrawl. The handwriting, she recognized, matched the note about Lionel's accounts she had glimpsed at the vicarage, confirming it as Ernest's. Her heart quickened, but her face remained serene. "Such an impressive safe," she said, her voice admiring, "and so orderly. But that note, how curious. Might it be relevant, Mr. Finch?" She pointed delicately, her tone innocent but her eyes sharp. Mr. Finch frowned, retrieving the note. With a grunt, he read it, his jowls quivering, and turned to Ernest, his voice sharp. "Wheeler, what's this? Meet me at the Manor, midnight. When was this written, and who was it for?" His eyes narrowed, and Miss Marple noted the sudden shift in his demeanour, from trust to suspicion. Ernest's face drained of colour, and he stammered, I don't know, sir. It's mine, yes, but it's old, from months ago. Just a reminder, nothing to do with the will." His voice cracked, and he took a step back, his hands raised as if to ward off accusation. Miss Marple noted the lie in his eyes, the way they darted to the door, and knew she had struck a nerve. She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Months ago, Mr. Wheeler, but the ink looks so fresh, doesn't it? And midnight at the Manor, such an unusual time for business." Her voice was soft, almost musing, but her words were a net, drawing tighter around Ernest's faltering composure. She thought of a village shop assistant who had hidden stolen goods, his lies unraveling under gentle pressure. Ernest, she felt, was teetering on the edge of confession, and she pressed ever so slightly. Was it perhaps the night the will went missing? "The village has been talking, you know, about your trips to London, your parcels." Ernest's eyes widened, and he shook his head, his voice rising. "No, ma'am, I swear. I didn't take the will. I don't know anything about it." His words were desperate, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching. And Miss Marple saw the truth in his panic, a man caught in a web of his own making. Mr. Finch's face darkened, and he stepped closer to Ernest, the note still in hand. "Wheeler, this is serious. If you've been meddling with my client's affairs, I'll have you out of here faster than you can blink. Explain yourself now." His voice was a low growl, and Miss Marple noted the solicitor's sudden anger, as if he had long suspected. His clerk's disloyalty. Ernest's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair, his bravado crumbling. "It's not what you think, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The note, it was for a friend at the Manor. Nothing to do with the will. I swear I locked it in the safe, like always." His eyes pleaded with Mr. Finch, but they avoided Miss Marple's, and she knew he was lying, or at least withholding the full truth. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, Mr. Wheeler, it's easy to misunderstand, isn't it? But that note and the envelope at the Manor, they do make one wonder." She turned to Mr. Finch, her tone gentle but firm. "Perhaps you might check the safe again, Mr. Finch, just to be sure nothing else has been overlooked." Her suggestion was polite, but her eyes were resolute, urging him to act. Mr. Finch hesitated, then rummaged through the safe, his hands shaking slightly. He pulled out folders, ledgers, and envelopes, but nothing resembled the will. "It's as I said, Miss Marple," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "Gone, and no trace. But this note," he waved it at Ernest, his eyes blazing. "You've got some explaining to do, lad. I trusted you." Ernest's face crumpled, and he took another step back, his hands raised. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean please. It's not what it looks like." His voice was a plea, but Miss Marple saw the guilt in his eyes, the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. She thought of Clara's fear, Lionel's debts, and the false trail in Much Benham. Ernest, with his access to the safe and his midnight note, was at the heart of the mystery, and she felt the threads beginning to converge. Mr. Finch, his patience exhausted, pointed to the door. "We'll talk later, Wheeler. Get back to your desk, and don't touch a thing until I say so." His voice was cold, and Ernest slunk out, his shoulders hunched, leaving Miss Marple and Mr. Finch alone. Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand. "Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Finch," she said, her smile warm. "I'm sure the will turn up, and your diligence will be rewarded. I'll let the church know you're doing all you can." She adjusted her hat, her mind buzzing with the morning's revelations. The note, Ernest's panic, and the empty safe confirmed her suspicions. The clerk was involved, but whether as thief or pawn, she couldn't yet say, as she stepped into the high street, the market's bustle a stark contrast to the office's tension. Miss Marple decided to visit Dolly Bantry, whose sharp wit might help her pass Ernest's actions. The bus ride back to St. Mary Mead was swift, and by the time she reached Bantry Manor, her plan was clear. She would verify the note's date and probe Ernest's ties to Clara and Lionel, perhaps through Mrs. Price's nephew at the Much Benham post office. Dolly greeted her with a laugh, ushering her into a drawing room where a tea tray waited. "Jane, you're at it again," she said, pouring tea. "What's the latest on that will? Don't tell me that clerk's the mastermind. He's too twitchy for that." Her eyes sparkled, but there was a shrewdness beneath her levity, and Miss Marple knew she could trust her friend's instincts. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the tea. "Twitchy, but cunning, Dolly. Ernest's note in the safe. Meet me at the manor. Midnight is a clue, and his panic when I showed the envelope tells me he's hiding something. I think he took the will, or knows who did," she recounted. Her visit, her voice soft but precise, laying out the clues like stitches in a pattern. Dolly's eyes widened, and she set her cup down with a clink. "Good heavens, Jane, that's damning. A midnight meeting. Sounds like a conspiracy. But who was he, Matan Clara, with her sad story, or Lionel, with his debts? And what about that envelope? Do you think he planted it at the manor?" She leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "The envelope was a mistake, Dolly, or a decoy. Ernest's ambition drives him, but he's not alone. Clara's fear and Lionel's desperation are part of it, I'm sure. I need to know who he met that night, and what those London parcels contain." She paused, her eyes gleaming. "I'll speak to Mrs. Price's nephew again, and perhaps revisit the manor. Ernest's a thread I'm pulling, and it's starting to unravel." Dolly laughed, clapping her hands. "You're a marvel, Jane, like a fox in a henhouse, only politer. But be careful, notes like that mean someone's desperate, and desperate people lash out." She raised her cup, a mock toast to Miss Marple. Quest, as Miss Marple walked home in the frosty dusk, the village lights glowing softly, her mind was busy. The note in the safe was a cornerstone of the mystery, but its meaning, conspiracy, theft, or betrayal, was unclear. She resolved to investigate Ernest's parcels and his midnight meeting, perhaps through the post office or a discreet inquiry. At the manor, a village scandal, years ago, had unraveled when a clerk's secret rendezvous exposed his theft. Ernest, Miss Marple felt, held a similar key, and she would find it. By the time she reached her cottage, her knitting needles were calling, but her true work unraveling the truth was in full swing. Chapter 11. The confrontation, the late September dusk, draped St. Mary Mead in a veil of soft shadows. The village's cottages glowing with lamplight as the air grew sharp with the promise of frost. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlour fire, with a cup of tea and her knitting idol in her lap, turned over the threads of the mystery that had consumed her days. The missing will of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves had woven an intricate web linal Brent's reckless debts. Clara Tuttle's shadowed past, Mrs. Gibbs's unyielding loyalty, Ernest Wheeler's furtive ambition, the solicitor's envelope in the study, the false trail of Clara's much Benham sighting, and the damning note in the safe. Meet me at the manor, midnight. Each clue had tightened the pattern, and Miss Marple, with her quiet knack for unravelling human nature, felt the truth within reach. Ernest's panic at the solicitor's office, coupled with his London trips and the note's implications, pointed to him as the linchpin. She resolved to gather the players at Hargreaves Manor under the pretence of discussing the Church Restoration Fund, to confront them with her findings and watch their reactions unmask the culprit. The following morning, a Sunday, dawned with a crystalline clarity, the church bells ringing across the village as Miss Marple donned a sober navy dress and a hat adorned with a single velvet ribbon. Her basket, containing parish newsletters and the solicitor's envelope as a silent prop, swung lightly as she walked to Hargreaves Manor, her steps purposeful yet unhurried. The manor's Georgian facade stood stark against the autumn sky, its ivy-clad walls bearing the weight of secrets, and Miss Marple noted the ground's continued neglect, the gravel drive now littered with fallen leaves. She had sent notes to Lionel Brent, Clara Tuttle, Mr. Finch, and Ernest Wheeler, requesting their presence for a village matter at the manor, and Mrs. Gibbs had agreed to host. Her loyalty to the late Mrs. Hargreaves ensuring her cooperation. Mrs. Gibbs opened the door, her angular face etched with curiosity but tempered by her usual reserve. "Miss Marple, you've brought quite a crowd," she said, her tone clipped but not unwelcoming. "They're in the drawing-room, as you asked. I've set out tea." Her eyes flickered to the basket, as if sensing its contents held more than newsletters, and Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs," she replied, stepping into the entrance hall, where the Hargreaves ancestors' portraits gazed down with their eternal disapproval. The mahogany table, now bare, bore faint scratches, as if an object had been dragged across it, a detail. Miss Marple filed away as she followed the housekeeper to the drawing-room. The room was as grand as ever, with brocade curtains and gilt-framed landscapes, but the air was heavy with tension, the fire in the grate doing little to warm the atmosphere. Lionel Brent lounged by the mantel, his handsome face set in a forced smile, his tweed jacket rumpled as if he'd slept in it. Clara Tuttle perched on a sofa, her grey dress blending with the shadows, her hands twisting a handkerchief with a desperation that Miss Marple noted with quiet sympathy. Mr. Finch stood near a window, his florid face creased with unease, his spectacles slipping as he adjusted his tie. Ernest Wheeler hovered by the door, his sallow complexion paler than usual, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Mrs. Gibbs, after setting the tea tray, lingered at the edge of the room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her basket at her feet, and smiled at the assembled group. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice gentle but carrying the authority of one who had unravelled many a village mystery. "I've asked you here under the guise of the Church Restoration Fund, but I confess my true purpose is Mrs. Hargreaves's will. Its disappearance has caused such distress, and I believe we can resolve it together." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, moving from face to face, noting Lionel's forced nonchalance, Clara's trembling hands, Mr. Finch's frown, Ernest's frozen posture, and Mrs. Gibbs's watchful silence. Lionel laughed, a brittle sound that echoed in the room. "Miss Marple, you're full of surprises," he said, his voice striving for levity. "But I'm not sure what we can do. The will's gone, and we're all in the dark." His fingers drummed on the mantel, betraying his unease, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, a sign of nerves beneath his charm. Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves wanted us to be secure, and now—" Her words trailed off, and she dabbed at her eyes, her handkerchief now a crumpled rag. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, his jowls quivering. "I've done all I can, Miss Marple. The safe was secure, but the key, well, it's vanished, like the will itself." His tone was defensive, and he glanced at Ernest, who flinched under his gaze. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression sympathetic but her mind analytical. "Indeed, Mr. Finch, a most perplexing puzzle. But puzzles, you know, have a way of solving themselves when you lay out the pieces." She drew the solicitor's envelope from her basket, holding it up as if it were a mere curiosity. "This, for instance, found by Mrs. Gibbs in the study, hidden under the blotter. It's from your office, Mr. Finch, but empty. Most curious, don't you think?" Her eyes moved to Ernest, who paled, his hands clenching at his sides. Mr. Finch's brow furrowed, and he took the envelope, examining it with a frown. "I saw this at my office, Miss Marple, but I'd no idea it was at the Manor. Wheeler, you delivered papers. Here did you leave this?" His voice was sharp, and Ernest's flush deepened, his eyes darting to the door. I don't know, sir," Ernest stammered, his voice cracking. "I took documents for Mrs. Hargreaves, but I didn't hide anything. Maybe she kept it herself." His words were rushed, and Miss Marple noted the lie in his eyes, the way his hands trembled, betraying a guilt he could not conceal. She pressed on, her tone gentle but unrelenting. "And then there's this note, found in your safe, Mr. Finch." She produced a slip of paper, a copy she had made of the note's text, "Meet me at the Manor. Midnight," careful not to reveal she had seen the original. "In your handwriting, Mr. Wheeler, dated the night the will vanished. A midnight meeting at the Manor is rather unusual, isn't it?" Her eyes locked on Ernest's, and she saw the panic flare, his breath coming in short gasps. Lionel straightened, his smile fading. "Midnight? What's this, Wheeler? Sneaking about my aunt's house?" His voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he suspected more than he let on. Clara gasped, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and Mrs. Gibbs's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening like a sentinel's. Ernest shook his head, his voice rising. "It's not what you think. The note, it was for a friend, nothing to do with the will. I swear I didn't. Take it." His words were desperate, but Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes, a man caught in a lie, his ambition unraveling under scrutiny. She leaned forward, her voice soft but commanding the room's attention. "Let us consider the pieces, shall we, Lionel? Your debts are no secret, and your talk of coming into money suggests a desperate hope for the full estate. Clara, your fear of losing your inheritance, rooted in a painful past, might have driven you to act or to trust someone you shouldn't. Mrs. Gibbs, your loyalty to Mrs. Hargreaves is fierce, but even loyalty can blind one to truth. And Mr. Wheeler," she turned to Ernest, her eyes piercing your ambition to rise above your station, your access to the safe, your visits to the manor, and this note all point to you. The will was taken, not lost, and I believe you took it, hoping to manipulate the inheritance through blackmail or forgery. Her words were calm, but they fell like stones, and the room grew silent. The fire's crackle the only sound. Ernest's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. No, you've got it wrong, Miss Marple, he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction, and his shoulders shook with the weight of his guilt. Lionel's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his eyes blazing. Is this true, Wheeler? Did you steal my aunt's will? His voice was low, dangerous, and Miss Marple noted the shift, as if his own fears were turning to anger. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her voice trembling. Ernest, please, tell the truth. If you know where the will is, say so. Mrs. Hargreaves wanted us to be safe. Her plea was heartfelt, but Miss Marple saw a flicker of something else, relief, perhaps. That suspicion had shifted from her. Mr. Finch's face was thunderous, his spectacles slipping as he pointed at Ernest. Wheeler, if you've betrayed my trust, I'll see you ruined. Where's the will? Speak, boy. His voice boomed, and Ernest flinched, his hands dropping to reveal a face etched with despair under Miss Marple's steady gaze. Ernest's resolve broke. All right, he cried, his voice cracking. I took it, but I didn't mean harm. I thought I could hold it, just for a bit, to make sure I got something, a fee, maybe, for my troubles. I was going to return it, I swear. His words tumbled out, and he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It's in my lodging, in Much Benham, hidden in a book. I didn't destroy it, I couldn't. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her heart quickening. She had expected a confession, but the speed of Ernest's collapse confirmed her suspicions. Ambition had driven him, but fear had undone him. She thought of a village boy who had stolen a silver tray, his confessions spilling out under gentle pressure. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler, she said softly. You've done the right thing. Mrs. Gibbs, might you telephone the police? They'll need to retrieve the will. Her tone was calm, but her authority was absolute, and Mrs. Gibbs nodded, her face grim as she moved to the telephone. Lionel sank onto the sofa, his face pale. Good God, Wheeler, you fool, he muttered, but there was relief in his eyes, as if a weight had lifted. Clara wept quietly, her handkerchief sodden, and Mr. Finch shook his head, his anger giving way to exhaustion. Mrs. Gibbs returned, confirming the police were on their way, and Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand. You've all been through a great ordeal, she said, her voice gentle, but Mrs. Hargreaves's wishes will be honored now. Motive and opportunity, you see, are like stitches in a pattern. Pull the right thread, and the truth unravels. Her eyes twinkled, but her expression was solemn, a reminder of the human frailties she had exposed. As the police arrived, Miss Marple slipped out, leaving the manor to its reckoning. The frosty air was bracing, and she walked home with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Ernest's confession had resolved the mystery, but the threads, Lionel's desperation, Clara's fear, Mrs. Gibbs's loyalty had all played their part. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a clerk's ambition led to theft, his downfall a matter of time. Ernest, she felt, was no different, and the will's recovery would restore order to Hargreaves Manor by the time she reached her cottage. The stars were bright above St. Mary Mead, and her knitting needles were calling. She settled by the fire, her mind already turning to the next day's tasks, perhaps a visit to Dolly Bantry, to recount the tale over tea. The mystery was solved, but Miss Marple knew human nature would always provide another puzzle, and she would be ready to unravel it. Chapter 12. The Will Restored. The early October dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle radiance, the village stirring under a sky streaked with pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of marmalade toast, gazed out at the dew-kissed roses in her garden, her mind lingering on the resolution of the Hargreaves mystery. The missing will of Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves had been a knot of human frailties, Lionel Brent's reckless debts, Clara Tuttle's shadowed fears, Mrs. Gibbs's fierce loyalty, Ernest Wheeler's thwarted ambition, the hidden envelope, the false trail in Much Benham, and the damning midnight note. Ernest's confession at the manor, under the weight of her quiet scrutiny, had unravelled the truth, and the will, retrieved from his lodging, had restored order. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of village life, knew that resolutions left ripples, and she resolved to visit Hargreaves Manor one last time, under the pretence of delivering a church flower rota, to observe the aftermath and ensure the threads were fully tied. She donned a woolen dress in soft lavender and a hat adorned with a sprig of dried heather, her appearance as unassuming as ever, though her purpose was as sharp as the autumn air. Her basket, containing the flower rota and a skein of pale blue wool for plausibility, swung lightly as she walked the familiar path to the manor, the cobblestones glinting with frost. Hargreaves Manor stood proud against the morning light, its Georgian facade softened by ivy, though Miss Marple noted a subtle changer freshly swept drive, a few pruned rose bushes, as if the household were awakening from its grief. She rang the bell, and Mrs. Gibbs appeared, her angular face less guarded than before, a hint of relief softening her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said, her tone warmer than usual. "You've been a blessing to this house, I'll say that. Come in, Miss Tuttle and Mr. Brent are in the drawing-room." She stepped aside, her black dress rustling, and led Miss Marple through the entrance hall, where the Hargreaves ancestors' portraits seemed less stern, as if approving the restoration of their legacy. The mahogany table, once marked by a dust-free rectangle and scratches, now held a polished silver bowl, a sign of renewed care. "Thank you, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle but her gaze alert, noting the housekeeper's eased demeanour. "I've brought the church flower rota. Thought Miss Tuttle might like to take a turn, now that things are settling." She followed Mrs. Gibbs to the drawing-room, its brocade curtains and gilt-framed landscapes bathed in morning light, the fire in the grate casting a warm glow. The room felt lighter, as if the weight of uncertainty had lifted, and Miss Marple sensed the manor breathing again. Lionel Brent stood by the window, his tall figure less slouched, his tweed jacket pressed for once. His handsome face bore a cautious optimism, and his smile, when he turned to greet Miss Marple, was genuine, though tinged with chagrin. Clara Tuttle sat on a sofa, her grey dress replaced by a soft blue one, her mousy hair looser, framing her face with a tentative softness. Her hands, free of the usual handkerchief, rested calmly in her lap, and her eyes, though still shadowed, held a spark of hope. Mrs. Gibbs lingered by the tea-tray, her presence a quiet anchor, and Miss Marple noted the subtle harmony among them, a stark contrast to the tension of her last visit. "Miss Marple, you're a marvel," Lionel said, stepping forward with a hand outstretched. "You've saved us from a proper mess. The will's back, thanks to you, and we're all square now." His voice was warm, but there was a humility in his tone, as if his brush with suspicion had sobered him. Clara nodded, her smile shy but sincere. "It's true, Miss Marple. We're so grateful. Mrs. Hargreaves's wishes are safe, and I feel I can breathe again." Her voice was soft, but there was a steadiness Miss Marple hadn't heard before, as if Clara had found her footing after years of fear. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her basket at her feet, and drew out the flower rota, her smile disarming. "I'm only an old woman who asks too many questions," she said, her tone light but her eyes keen, moving from Lionel to Clara to Mrs. Gibbs. "But I'm glad the will's been found. I thought I'd bring the flower rota, Miss Tuttle, and see how you're all faring. It's a comfort, isn't it, to have things settled?" She handed the rota to Clara, her gaze lingering on Lionel, testing for any lingering unease. Lionel laughed, a sound freer than before, though his fingers still drummed lightly on the window ledge. "Settled, indeed. The will splits the estate evenly, as Aunt Eleanor intended, half for me, half for Clara. I've had a word with my creditors, Miss Mop. I'm selling a few acres to clear the debts, and I'll manage the rest properly, I swear it." His eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of resolve, as if his ordeal had forced a reckoning with his recklessness. Clara clutched the rota, her fingers tracing the paper. "And I'm planning a charity, Miss Marple, in Mrs. Hargreaves's name for the village children, a school fund. It's what she'd have wanted to give back." Her voice was firm, and Miss Marple noted the change, a quiet strength born of security. Clara's past, with its betrayal and loss, had made her fearful, but the will's restoration had given her purpose, and Miss Marple felt a quiet pride in her resilience. Mrs. Gibbs poured tea, her movements precise but less rigid, as if the manor's harmony had eased her own burdens. "Mrs. Hargreaves would be pleased," she said, her voice low but warm. "She always said the manor was for family, not fighting. You've done her proud, Miss Marple." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and there was a rare glint of gratitude, a softening of her usual reserve. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind analytical, piecing together the final threads. Ernest Wheeler's confession had been the key. His ambition to secure a share of the estate through blackmail or forgery undone by his own nerves. The police, summoned by Mrs. Gibbs, had retrieved the will from his lodging. Hidden in a hollowed-out law book, a detail Miss Marple found both fitting and ironic. Mr. Finch, shaken by his clerk's betrayal, had overseen the will's authentication, confirming its terms, an equal division between Lionel and Clara, with a small bequest for Mrs. Gibbs's long service. The manor, its lands, and Mrs. Hargreaves's fortune were secure, and the village's gossip, once fevered, had quieted to murmurs of relief. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, probed gently to ensure no loose ends remained. "It's a great relief, isn't it, to have Mrs. Hargreaves's wishes honoured?" she said, her tone mild but her eyes moving from face to face. "Though I do wonder about young Mr. Wheeler. Such ambition, to take such a risk. Did he ever hint at his plans, Mr. Brent, when he visited the manor?" Her question was casual, but her gaze was sharp, testing Lionel's response for any hidden knowledge. Lionel shook his head, his smile wry. "Not a word, Miss Marple." He was all politeness, delivering papers, chatting with Clara in the garden. "I thought him a bit of a toady, but never a thief." His tone was sincere, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease, as if he regretted his own blindness to Ernest's scheming. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at the rota. "He was kind to me, Miss Marple, offering to help with Mrs. Hargreaves's papers. I never thought. I feel such a fool for trusting him." Her voice was soft, but there was a resolve in it, as if she were determined to learn from her mistake. Miss Marple nodded, her heart softening for Clara's vulnerability, though her mind recalled the false trail in Much Benham, likely Ernest's attempt to deflect suspicion onto her. Mrs. Gibbs set the teapot down with a faint clink, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He was too smooth, that one," she said, "always lingering, asking questions about the manor. I should have watched him closer, but I thought he was just doing his job." Her tone was bitter, and Miss Marple saw the self-reproach in her eyes, a loyal servant's regret for failing her mistress. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "You all did your best, Mrs. Gibbs. Human nature is a tricky thing, isn't it? Motive and opportunity, they twist people in ways we don't expect." She thought of Ernest's midnight note, his London parcels, and his desperate bid for a better life. She recalled a village grocer who had stolen to fund a dream, his confession spilling out when cornered. Ernest, she felt, was no different. His ambition, a flame that had burned him. She shifted the conversation to the flower rota, drawing Clara into a discussion of chrysanthemums and lilies, watching as the young woman's face brightened with purpose. Lionel joined in, offering to fund the church's new hymnals, his tone earnest, as if eager to prove his reform. Mrs. Gibbs, serving biscuits, listened with a quiet pride, and Miss Marple sensed the manor's wounds beginning to heal. Yet her mind remained alert, ensuring no detail had been overlooked. "I heard Mr. Finch was quite shaken," she said, her tone light. "Has he said anything more about Ernest's actions? It must be a blow, losing a trusted clerk." Lionel shrugged, his fingers stilling on the window ledge. "Finch is furious, but he's got the will now, so he's calming down. Says Ernest's been sacked, and the police are handling him. Good riddance, I say." His voice was firm, but there was a trace of pity, as if he recognized his own narrow escape from suspicion. Clara nodded, her eyes on the rota. "Mr. Finch came yesterday to read the will properly. It's all as Mrs. Hargreaves wanted fair. Clear, he's promised to oversee everything, to make sure there's no more trouble." Her voice was steady, and Miss Marple noted the relief, as if the weight of her past fears had lifted. Mrs. Gibbs poured a second round of tea, her movements fluid. "Mr. Finch is a good man," she said. "He's vowed to double-check every document from now on. No more clerks poking about without oversight." Her tone was resolute, and Miss Marple saw the steel in her eyes. A guardian restored to her post, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind satisfied but ever watchful. The will's recovery had closed the case, but she probed one final thread to ensure no shadows remained. "It's curious, isn't it, how Ernest thought he could profit from such a scheme," she said, her voice musing. "Blackmail, perhaps, or a forged copy. Did he ever approach either of you, Mr. Brent, Miss Tuttle, with suggestions about the estate?" Her question was delicate, but her eyes were sharp, testing for any hint of collusion. Lionel's eyes widened, and he shook his head. "Not me, Miss Marple. I'd have sent him packing if he tried." His tone was indignant, but sincere, and Miss Marple believed him. His debts a motive, but not a conspiracy. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head vigorously. "Never. Miss Marple, he was kind, but I didn't know his plans. I'm so glad it's over." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were clear, and Miss Marple saw no deception. Mrs. Gibbs, clearing the tea tray, added, "He never spoke to me, Miss Marple, except about papers. If I'd known what he was up to, I'd have had him out the door myself." Her tone was fierce, and Miss Marple nodded, satisfied that the housekeeper's loyalty had been to Mrs. Hargreaves, not Ernest. As the conversation turned to village matters, the harvest festival, the new curates, sermons, Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand. "You've all been so kind to indulge an old woman," she said, her smile warm. "I'm glad the manor is at peace. Mrs. Hargreaves would be proud." She handed the flower rota to Clara, her eyes twinkling. "Do take a turn at the church. Flowers, my dear. It's a lovely way to honour her memory." Clara smiled, her face brighter than Miss Marple had ever seen. "I will, Miss Marple, and thank you for everything." Lionel nodded, his expression grateful, and Mrs. Gibbs escorted her out, her silence a testament to her restored calm. As Miss Marple walked back to the village, the manor fading into the morning mist, her mind was at ease. The will's restoration had righted the wrongs, and the players, Lionel, Clara, Mrs. Gibbs, were moving forward, their motives laid bare but their futures secure. Ernest's ambition had been his downfall, a tale as old as the village itself. She thought of a St. Mary Mead grocer's assistant, years ago, whose theft of a cash box had unravelled under quiet scrutiny, his dreams no match for truth. Ernest, she felt, was a similar cautionary tale. His midnight note and hidden will a misstep in a game he couldn't win. Her thoughts turned to Dolly Bantry, whose sharp wit would relish the tale's conclusion. The walk to Bantry Manor was brisk, the lanes lined with golden leaves, and by the time she arrived, her plan was clear. She would share the resolution over tea, ensuring no detail was missed. Dolly greeted her with a laugh, ushering her into a drawing-room where a fire roared. "Jane, you've done it again," Dolly said, pouring tea from a silver pot. "The will's found, and the village is buzzing. Tell me everything, don't leave out a single stitch." Her eyes sparkled, and Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair with her tea. "It was Ernest Wheeler, Dolly, as I suspected," she said, her voice soft but precise. "His ambition drove him to steal the will, hoping to profit through blackmail or forgery, but his nerves betrayed him, and the note in the safe, 'Meet me at the manor, midnight,' was the key." She recounted the confrontation, the confession, and the will's recovery, her words weaving the tale like a finished scarf. Dolly's eyes widened, and she clapped her hands. "Good heavens, Jane, you're a genius. Ernest, a thief, and that note pure melodrama. But what about Lionel and Clara? Are they truly in the clear?" She leaned forward, her curiosity insatiable. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. Lionel's debts made him desperate, but not dishonest. Clara's fears were real, but her heart was true. Mrs. Gibbs's loyalty kept her vigilant, not complicit. The wills restored their futures, Dolly and the manors at peace. She paused, her eyes twinkling. "Motive and opportunity, you see, are like my knitting pull the right thread, and the pattern emerges." Dolly laughed, raising her cup in a toast. "You're a marvel, Jane. The village doesn't deserve you. But be careful, there's always another mystery, and you'll be off chasing it before the tea's cold." Her grin was infectious, and Miss Marple chuckled, her heart light as she walked home in the gathering dusk. The village lights twinkling like stars, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The Hargreaves mystery was solved, its threads neatly tied, but she knew St. Mary Mead would always offer new puzzles, new patterns to unravel. By the time she reached her cottage, her cat, Tuppence, greeted her with a purr, and her knitting needles were calling. She settled by the fire, her mind already turning to the next day's tasks, content in the knowledge that truth, like a well-knit scarf, always found its shape in her hands.